Wade Rourke slammed the bowl down so hard the table shook. "Take it back," he said. "I'm not eating food cooked by some mail-order woman who doesn't know the difference between a ranch and a hotel." 18 men went dead quiet. Clara Vance didn't move, didn't flinch. She looked at the bowl sitting there, her stew, still steaming, and then she looked at Wade. "You don't have to eat it," she said, "but every man here worked 14 hours today, and I didn't cook it for you." She picked up the bowl and set it in front of the youngest hand at the table. The boy couldn't have been more than 17, looked up at her like he didn't know what to do. "Eat," she said quietly. He did, and that was the moment everything changed at Ironwood Ranch. If you were in her shoes, a stranger, an outsider, a woman no one wanted there, what would you have done? But before we go any further, if stories like this one, about ordinary people who refuse to stay small, speak to something in you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Because these are the kinds of stories that deserve to go everywhere. Now let's go back to the beginning. The stagecoach pulled into Dry Creek on a Thursday, and nobody came to meet it. That was the first thing Clara Vance noticed. She had traveled 11 days from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 11 days of bad roads, stale biscuits, and a seatmate who snored like a dying engine. And when she finally stepped down onto Wyoming soil with her 2 suitcases and her satchel of recipe books, the only person waiting was the stagecoach driver, who immediately began unloading someone else's freight. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. The wind was different out here. Back home it came soft through oak trees and smelled like river mud and chimney smoke. Out here it came straight across flat land and hit you like it had a personal grievance. Clara pulled her coat tighter and looked around. Dry Creek was smaller than she'd imagined. A general store, a land office, a livery, a saloon that looked like it had survived several arguments and lost most of them. A few buildings she couldn't name, mud streets that weren't quite dry and weren't quite wet. She sat down on one of her suitcases and waited. 40 minutes passed. She was not the kind of woman who panicked. She had learned early that panicking used energy she couldn't afford to waste. So instead, she watched. The way a wagon driver argued with the liveryman over wheel repairs. The way 2 women near the general store spoke to each other in the careful way of people who were neighbors but not friends. The way a dog circled the same spot in the street 3 times before lying down, unconvinced. When the man finally came, she almost missed him. He came from the north end of the street, riding a horse with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on solid ground. He wasn't what she expected. She had built an image in her mind from his letters, careful, formal letters that told her almost nothing personal, and the image she'd built was of someone older, more rigid, more obviously wealthy. Silas Mercer was perhaps 34 or 35. He had a face that the weather had worked on, a jaw that suggested he had opinions and rarely changed them, and eyes the color of river water in November gray-green, cold, difficult to read. He dismounted, looked at her, and said, "You're smaller than I thought." Clara looked at him. "You're later than you said." Beat of silence. "Road was washed out past the ridge," he said. "I would have appreciated a note." He looked at her suitcases, then at her, then at the recipe satchel hanging off her shoulder. Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. Not contempt exactly. More like quiet recalculation. "I've got a wagon coming," he said. "Good." They did not speak again until the wagon arrived. The ride to Ironwood Ranch took just over an hour, and it was not a comfortable hour. It wasn't that Silas was unfriendly. He simply wasn't there, in the way some people manage to be physically present, while their mind has already moved 3 conversations ahead. He answered her questions directly and briefly. The ranch was 1,200 acres. He ran cattle, primarily. He had 18 men on payroll, permanent hands and seasonal workers both. The last housekeeper had left in September. "Why did she leave?" Clara asked. Silas kept his eyes on the road. The work was too much. Too much meaning the work itself, or too much meaning the people doing it. He glanced at her then, just briefly. "Both," he said, and looked away again. That at least she respected. A man who lied to get a wife was a man she didn't want to be married to. A man who told you plainly what you were walking into that she could work with, she thought. Ironwood Ranch was not what the letters had suggested. The house was large, genuine. genuinely large, the kind of structure that took serious money to build out here. But it had the look of something that had been built with care and then abandoned to its own devices. The porch railing leaned. One window shutter hung at an angle. The yard had been cleared at some point, but not recently, and the pathway to the front door was more mud than gravel. Not dirty exactly, but depleted. Like every surface had been wiped down by someone who was exhausted and doing the minimum and knew it. The curtains were gray. The floors needed a proper cleaning, not a swept one. In the main sitting room, a stack of ranch paperwork had colonized an entire side table and spilled onto the floor. Clara walked through the house quietly. Silas followed her without speaking, which she appreciated. She didn't need a tour. She needed to look. She found the kitchen last. Kitchen was large. That was the one mercy with a cast iron stove that had once been good and was now suffering in the particular way of things that hadn't been properly maintained. The firebox needed cleaning. The draft was restricted. She could see from the black buildup around the flue that someone had been burning green wood. Most of its windows were dark, which meant every meal cooked in here, for the past several months, had been fighting a stove that couldn't reach the right temperature. She opened the larder, half empty. What remained was poorly organized cornmeal in a sack that had gotten damp on one side, dried beans that were fine, salt pork that was fine, some tinned goods, coffee, and a collection of spices that hadn't been used in so long. Some of them had lost their smell entirely. She looked at the stove again. "Do you have a proper ash rake?" she asked. Silas blinked. "In the tool shed." "Bring it," she said, "and a bucket." He didn't move immediately. She turned and looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, your stove is half choked. Whatever your cook has been making on it has been cooked at the wrong temperature for months. I need an hour with this stove before I can make anything worth eating." He stared at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. She still couldn't read him well enough to know what it meant. "I'll send one of the hands," he said. "Send whoever you like," she said, and turned back to the stove. The ranch hands came in for supper at 6 o'clock. Clara had 3 hours. The ash rake arrived with a 16-year-old boy named Tommy, who looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes and clearly expected to be sent back out immediately. Instead, she handed him an apron. "I need help," she said. "Can you lift a stock pot?" He could. He was actually quite useful once he stopped looking like he expected punishment. She cleaned the stove. This took 40 minutes, and her arms ached by the end of it, but when she relit the fire using the dry, split wood she'd found properly stacked, good wood behind the smokehouse, the stove pulled correctly for the first time in what she suspected was months. The heat came up steady and even. She worked with what she had. Salt pork rendered down. Onion from the cellar, a whole crate of them. Slightly soft, but usable. Dried beans she'd started soaking the moment she arrived. Potatoes. A jar of preserved tomatoes she found behind 3 other things on the larder shelf. Cornmeal. She made a stew and a Johnny cake both, because one or the other might fail, and she couldn't afford that on her first night. The stew didn't fail. She tasted it at 5:30 and adjusted the salt, and found the old pepper grinder on the back of the shelf, and used it. And then she tasted it again, and felt the small, quiet satisfaction of something done right. Tommy looked at the pot like he'd never seen food before. "When did you all eat last?" she asked. He thought about it. "Proper, maybe. 3 days ago, Hank made beans. They weren't terrible. And before that," he made a face. "Sit down," she said, and ladled him a bowl before the men arrived. He was halfway through it when he stopped, spoon in midair, and said, "Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten since I left home." She looked at him. He was completely serious. "Don't tell me," she said. "Tell your stomach. It's the one that needed convincing." They came in at 6, all 18 of them, and the kitchen was not large enough. They spilled into the dining room, and Clara directed Tommy to carry the pots. And she set the bread on the table herself, and the noise was immediate and overwhelming, and she stood at the kitchen door and watched them eat. Most of them didn't say a word. Men who are genuinely hungry don't compliment food. They just eat. She had learned that a long time ago. But some looked up, and then there was Wade Rourke. She had noticed him the moment the men came in, not because he was the largest, he wasn't, but because the other moved slightly around him the way water moves around a stone. He was perhaps 40, with a foreman's bearing and a foreman's face, permanently skeptical, permanently measuring everything. He sat down, looked at the bowl someone placed in front of him, and didn't pick up his spoon. "Where's Silas?" he asked. "Mr. Mercer is eating at the house," Clara said from the doorway. Wade looked at her. He had the kind of look that's not quite rude and not quite respectful, the look of a man assessing a situation and finding it wanting. "Who cooked this?" he asked, though he already knew. "I did," she said. He looked at the bowl again, pushed it slightly away from him. "I don't eat food cooked by women who don't know what they're getting into," he said. No offense meant. "None taken," what Clara said, because she needed these men to function and couldn't afford a fight on day one. But she also didn't move. Wade looked at her again, waiting probably for her to retreat, to apologize. To explain herself, she looked back at him. "You can eat or not eat," she said. "That's your business. But I want you to know something." She kept her voice even. "I've been in bad kitchens, sick camps, households with no supplies and no budget. I've cooked for people who were worse off than tired cowboys, and not one of them went to bed hungry. So you can doubt me if you like. I'd probably doubt me too, in your position. But doubting me won't change what's in the pot." She went back into the kitchen. Behind her, she heard the clink of a spoon. She didn't turn around. Later, when the men had left and Tommy was washing the pots, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and went through her situation honestly. She had married a man she did not know. She was living in a house that felt like it was held together by habit rather than maintenance. She was working with limited supplies, a household staff that didn't exist, and a foreman who had made it clear that he considered her an inconvenience. She had also in 3 hours cooked the best meal this ranch had eaten in months. She wasn't proud exactly. It wasn't about pride. It was about the simple arithmetic of a situation, what was needed, what she had, and what she could do with the gap between them. She pulled out her second recipe book, not the cooking one, but the one she used for management, and began making notes. Plies to order, repairs needed, things she'd observed about how the kitchen was organized versus how it should be. She wrote for an hour. She went to bed at 11 after checking the stove was properly damped. At 4:30 in the morning, she was back in the kitchen. She had breakfast ready before the first man came in at 5. Wade Rourke stood in the kitchen doorway at 5:03 and looked at the biscuits cooling on the rack, the eggs working in the pan, the coffee already made and hot. He stood there for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said. "The men don't expect breakfast. They'll work better with it." Another pause. The pan sizzled. He didn't move. "How long you planning to keep this up?" he asked. "As long as I'm here." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt. Hard to categorize. "You're either tougher than you look," he said, "or you don't know yet what you're in for." "Probably both," she said. "Biscuit?" He took one. He didn't say thank you. But he ate it, standing at the doorway before the other men came in, and when he walked out toward the barn, his back was a little less rigid than it had been the night before. That was enough. 3 days passed. Clara learned the rhythm of the ranch, the way she learned everything by watching before acting, and by asking the right person the right question at the right time. Tommy knew where everything was, but not why it was there. A hand named Cutter knew the livestock schedule better than anyone. An older man named Pete, who said little and observed everything, turned out to be the closest thing the ranch had to institutional memory. She fed them, every meal on time, made from whatever she had, better than what they'd had before. And she listened. Men who are well-fed talk, not always about important things. But they talk, and if you are quiet enough and present enough, you hear things. On the 4th day, she heard something she hadn't expected. She was in the larder taking inventory, actually writing numbers, comparing them to the supply ledger she'd found buried in the desk drawer when 2 hands came through the kitchen without noticing her. She heard one say, "Short again. 3rd time this month." The other one, Rourke says, "It's miscounting." First one, Rourke knows it isn't miscounting. He's just not saying what he thinks it is. They moved through and out, and Clara stood still in the larder for a moment with her pencil on the page. She went back to the ledger. She ran the numbers again. Then she went and found the receipt book from the storage room where she'd seen it during her first walkthrough, and she brought both books to the kitchen table that night after supper, and she sat with them until midnight. When she closed them, she had a headache and an uncomfortable feeling that had nothing to do with the late hour. The numbers didn't match, not by a small amount, by a meaningful amount. Cattle coming in from summer grazing, counted and recorded. Then counted again at winter prep, and somehow the second number was consistently smaller than it should have been. Not dramatically, not the kind of drop that would make a man slam his fist on the table. Just quietly, persistently wrong. She thought about what the hand had said. She thought about the way Silas kept his accounts orderly on the surface. But she'd noticed during her first kitchen inventory that orderly surfaces didn't always mean orderly underneath. She thought about what she was and wasn't in a position to do. She was new here. 3 days new. She was a woman whose authority in this household was still being decided by 18 men who'd known each other for years. Most of its windows were dark. She could not walk into Silas Mercer's study, want cattle numbers based on 4 days of observation and a ledger she'd found in a drawer. She couldn't, but she could keep looking. She wrote down what she'd found in her management book in the back pages she kept for things that didn't belong anywhere else. Then she made herself go to sleep. The next afternoon, she met Silas Mercer at the same kitchen table on purpose. She'd asked Tommy to tell him she needed to discuss the supply order, which was true. She did need to discuss the supply order, but she also needed to understand what kind of man she was dealing with. He came in, sat down, and waited. He had the quality of a man who didn't fidget, who could sit still and just be in a room without needing to fill it. That was either discipline or emptiness, and she hadn't decided which yet. She went through the supply list first, genuinely. She'd prepared it carefully, with cost estimates from memory and reasoning for each item. He listened, asked 2 questions, both good ones, approved most of it. Then she said casually, "I've been organizing the larder inventory against your supply ledger." "I can see that," he said. "The records are fairly detailed," she said. "You're careful about what comes in." He nodded. "Are you equally careful about what goes out?" she asked. A beat of silence, his eyes on her. "Meaning?" he said. "Meaning I noticed some numbers that didn't quite." She stopped, pulled back, recalibrated. "It's probably nothing. I don't know your operation yet. I just noticed what looked like some variation in the counts from the summer ledger to the winter prep records." Silas was very still. "Where did you see those records?" he said. "The receipt book was in the storage room with the preserved jars," she said. "I needed the room and found it. I wasn't looking for it." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "I'll look at the books tonight," he said. "Of course," she said. And she poured him a coffee and asked about the bunkhouse roof, which she'd been told was leaking, and the conversation moved on. But she noticed, when he left, that he hadn't touched the coffee. And that night, past 11, she saw lamplight under the study door. He was in there a long time. In the morning, Wade Rourke came to find her. He came to the kitchen at 7, after the breakfast rush, when it was just her and Tommy cleaning up. Most of its windows were dark. He stopped at the threshold that same spot, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "Silas wants to talk to both of us," he said. She dried her hands on the cloth. "When now?" She followed him to the study. Silas was at his desk, and on the desk were both ledgers, and also a third one. She hadn't seen the actual livestock count log kept by Rourke. All 3 were open, and even from across the room she could see where he'd been working through them, comparing columns, marking places. He looked up when they came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Shark stood. Silas looked at the books and then at them both. "We're short," he said. "Not by a weather margin. Not by a sick count margin." He said a number. Rourke said a word under his breath that she chose not to hear. "How long?" Rourke asked. "From the summer count? 7 months. Possibly longer. Possibly since last spring." Silas's voice was controlled. Extremely controlled. The kind of controlled that meant there was something very uncontrolled directly beneath it. "I want to know how I missed this." "You've been busy," Rourke said. "That's not an excuse," Silas said. "No," Rourke agreed. "It isn't." Silas looked at Clara then. "You found this in 4 days." "I found a discrepancy," she said carefully. "I don't know what it means yet. I know what it looks like." "What does it look like?" She looked at him. At both of them. "It looks like someone who knows your records well enough to take a little at a time," she said. "Not too much. Just enough." The silence that followed that sentence had weight to it. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, and hit the house the way it always did, like it had personal grievances. Silas said, "I need to find out who." "Yes," Clara said. She didn't offer to help. She let him get there himself. He looked at the books for another long moment. Then he looked at her again, that flat, unreadable November River look, and said, "You were going to tell me, regardless." "I was," she said. "Even if I told you, the books were none of your business." "Yes." He was quiet then. "Why?" Clara thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I'm here now," she said. "And when something is wrong in a place I'm part of, I'd rather know than not know, even if it costs me something." Silas Mercer looked at his new wife. And for the first time since she'd stepped off a stagecoach into a Wyoming wind with 2 suitcases and a satchel full of recipe books, something in his face shifted into an expression she could almost read. Not warmth, not yet, but something like the beginning of respect. And for now, that was enough. The morning after that meeting in the study, nobody talked about it directly. That was something Clara had already learned about Ironwood Ranch. Things that mattered didn't get discussed openly. They got carried around in the way men held their shoulders. Conversation stopped when someone walked into a room. The way a particular silence could mean 6 different things, depending on who was doing the silence and who was watching. She noticed all of it. She also made cornmeal porridge, with salt pork crumbled through it, and a pot of coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright, and she had it on the table by 5:15, and she went about her morning as though nothing had changed. But things had changed. She felt it in the way Silas moved through the house that day, more deliberate, more contained, like a man who had discovered a leak in a dam and was now walking around the whole structure looking for more. She felt it in the way Wade Rourke looked at her across the breakfast table, not with the dismissal of day one, but with something more uncomfortable, the careful assessment of a man revising an opinion he'd held with some confidence. She didn't push it. She went back to work. The supply order had to be finalized. The bunkhouse roof situation needed to be understood before it got worse. She'd heard rain in the forecast from Pete, who apparently had opinions about clouds that turned out to be accurate. The larder needed a proper reorganization, not just the quick sort she'd done on arrival. And she had found, in the back of a kitchen cabinet, a ceramic crock that had once held something preserved, and now held only the ghost of it, and the whole cabinet smelled faintly wrong as a result. She dealt with the crock first because small problems left alone become large problems with bad timing. By mid-morning, she was reorganizing the dry goods shelf when Tommy came into the kitchen and hovered in the way he did when he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure he should. "What is it?" she said, without looking up. "Cutter wants to know if you're using the smokehouse," Tommy said. "Not yet?" "Why?" "He's got 2 hams he's been meaning to cure for 3 weeks, and no one's given him a time." Clara set down the bag of cornmeal she was holding. "Tell Cutter I'll have the smokehouse clean and ready by Thursday. I'll need his salt and his smoking wood, whatever he's been using. And tell him I want to talk about the curing process before he starts, because I've seen men ruin good pork in a hurry, and I'd rather not." Tommy nodded and left, clearly pleased to have delivered a concrete answer rather than a vague one. She went back to the shelf. She was starting to understand the architecture of this place, not the physical structure, but the human one. Who deferred to whom? Who knew things they weren't saying? Who was proud, and who was quietly desperate, and who was simply waiting to see what she was going to do before they committed to an opinion? There were 18 men on this ranch, and they were not all the same kind of trouble. Most of them were simply men doing a hard job with insufficient support. Could work with that. She could work with exhaustion and rough edges and the kind of low-level irritability that came from months of bad food and broken routines. What she was still figuring out was the specific geometry of the problem inside the numbers. Because someone on this ranch knew those cattle were gone, and that someone was eating her food every single day. On the 6th day, Victor Dane arrived. Clara didn't know who he was when he rode in. She saw him from the kitchen window, a man on a horse that was too well kept for this part of Wyoming, in a coat that fit too well to be a working man's coat. He rode with the ease of someone who knew he was being watched and had decided to look like he didn't care. He tied his horse at the post and went to the front door. She heard voices in the hallway. Silas's. Then this new one, smooth, unhurried, with a careful kind of warmth to it that she recognized immediately as the warmth of a man who had practiced it. She went back to the stew pot. An hour later, Silas came to the kitchen. "We'll need lunch for two," he said, at the house table. "You'll have it," she said. "Who is he?" Silas was already half turned to go. He stopped. "Land representative. Frontier Dominion Holdings. He has an offer regarding the southern grazing territory." "Is it a good offer?" Silas looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been asked a question he wasn't used to being asked by someone he wasn't used to asking it. "That remains to be seen," he said. She said a proper lunch. Not elaborate. She didn't have the provisions for elaborate and wouldn't have bothered anyway, but considered. The kind of meal that said the house was managed, that things were under control, that whoever lived here was not desperate. She'd learned early that food sent messages before anyone spoke. She brought the plates in herself. Victor Dane looked up at her with a smile that arrived just slightly too quickly. He had the kind of face that wanted you to like it, and it was good enough at the job that you almost missed how hard it was working. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I've heard good things about the cooking out here." "From who?" she said pleasantly. He blinked. "I beg your pardon? You've been in town, I assume. Who told you about the cooking?" A small pause. "Men talk in saloons," he said. "They do," she agreed, and set the last plate down and left. Stood to the kitchen doorway where she could hear but not be seen, and she listened to the first 12 minutes of that conversation. Dane was good at his work. He built from small things a compliment about the ranch, an observation about the territory, a shared frustration about the difficulty of making good land pay in a changing market. He moved toward the offer the way a good river poker player moves toward a high bet, slowly, with other moves covering the intent. By the time she heard him lay out the terms of the lease, Silas had already been softened 3 different ways without knowing it. She went back to the kitchen. She took out her management book. She wrote Victor Dane, Frontier Dominion Holdings, lease offer Southern Grazing Territory, 3 years, terms to be reviewed. She underlined the last 4 words twice. That evening, Silas sat at the kitchen table with the contract. This surprised her. She hadn't expected him to bring it to the kitchen. She'd expected him to take it to the study, to work through it alone the way he worked through everything. But it was past 9. The hands were all in the bunkhouse. Tommy had gone to bed, and Silas was at the kitchen table with a lamp and 4 pages of densely printed contract language, and he looked like a man who had been reading the same paragraph for 15 minutes. She poured him a coffee without asking and sat down across from him. He didn't tell her to leave. She took that as an invitation. "May I?" she said, and gestured to the contract. He looked at her. Then he slid it across the table. She read it the way she'd been taught, not the way most people read contracts, which was to look for the big things in the obvious places. She read it the way from someone who a person reads entirely like him, looking for what wasn't said and where the words were working harder than they needed to. She found it on page 3. It was buried in a paragraph about land improvements, the kind of language that looks like standard lease language, and mostly is, except for one clause that said the leasing company retained the right to construct permanent infrastructure improvements on any territory covered by the agreement, provided said improvements were deemed necessary for the productive use of the land. Permanent. She read it twice. She set the contract down. "This clause," she said, and pointed to the paragraph, "about permanent infrastructure." Silas looked. "It's standard. Most leases have improvement clauses. Most improvement clauses say the improvements revert to the landowner at the end of the lease," she said. "This one doesn't say that." He looked at the paragraph again. "It says they have the right to construct permanent infrastructure," she said slowly. "It doesn't say what happens to that infrastructure when the 3 years are up, which means a good lawyer could argue that any structure they build on your land during this lease becomes a standing claim." Silas was very still. He stopped. "Reread it." It would mean they could build something on your southern territory, and at the end of 3 years, they could argue they have a partial claim CAD to the land itself. Because of it, she said, and if they've built anything substantial, it gets complicated. Silence. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up again. "Nobody's going to build a fence post on Ironwood land claimed by territory," Silas said, and his voice had gone flat, in a way she hadn't heard before. "Maybe not," she said, "but they'd have the paperwork to try." He stared at the contract for a long moment. Then he looked at her. How did you? My father was a land clerk, she said. For 11 years, I read a lot of contracts. Another silence. Different from the others they'd had. More complicated. Why didn't you say that, he said. You didn't ask, she said simply. And I didn't know it would matter until it did. Silas put his hand flat on the contract page. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that almost cost him very much. Dane is coming back Thursday, he said. I know, she said.
Do you want me to look at the whole contract before then?
He looked at her across the lamp. Yes, he said. She pulled the contract back toward her and turned to page 1. She went through all 4 pages that night, at the kitchen table, with Silas reading alongside her. Took 2 hours. She made notes in the margin of a separate sheet. She wasn't going to mark up his copy until she was sure, and she found 3 more things that bothered her, none as serious as the first but all worth questioning. At 11:15, Silas sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd seen him do. I almost signed this Thursday, he said. I know, she said. Dane had it ready. Pen on the table. That's how it's meant to work, she said. Momentum. You feel like the decision's already been made and you're just making it official. He looked at her. You sound like you've seen this before. My father saw it all the time, she said. People came to the land office desperate. The man with the money had them half committed before they ever sat down. Paperwork was just the formality. She paused. It works because people want to believe the offer is real. They need it to be real. So they stop reading carefully. I wasn't desperate, Silas said with some edge. No, she agreed. But you were tired. It's not the same thing, but it produces some of the same results. He didn't like hearing that. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But he didn't argue it, which told her something useful. I'll need to talk to Crowley, he said. Edwin Crowley was the attorney in Dry Creek. She'd heard the name twice in passing conversations and filed it. Can you write up your notes tonight? They're already written, she said, and slid the separate sheet across to him. He looked at the sheet, then at her. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Since I was about 14, she said. My father taught me. He said no one should sign anything they don't understand. And most people don't understand most of what they sign. So somebody needs to be paying attention. She looked at the notes on the page. I was the somebody, usually. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, what happened to your father? He died, she said. 3 years ago, fever. And then you came west. Not immediately, she said. I stayed in Harrisburg for 2 years after. I had work. A boarding house, mostly. Cooking and management, she paused. Eventually it was time for something else. He didn't ask what had made it time. She was grateful for that. Your advertisement was the only one that was honest, she said. He looked at her. What do you mean? Most of the advertisements I read said things like comfortable home and good prospects. Yours said you needed someone capable of hard work and managing a difficult household, and that the winters were severe, and you couldn't promise anything beyond the practical. She looked at the lamp. I figured a man who wrote an honest advertisement was at least a man who wanted an honest arrangement. Silas was quiet. I wasn't trying to recruit the best candidate, he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite place. Not quite embarrassed. Something else. I was just accurate. I know, she said. That was the point. She spent 2 days reviewing the full contract before Victor Dane returned. In that time, she also went back to the supply ledger. It wasn't that she'd forgotten about the cattle discrepancy. It was that the contract had taken precedence, and she was one person with a finite number of hours in a day. But the numbers were still there, in the back of her mind, the way a wrong note in a song stays in your ear. On Wednesday, she went through both ledgers again, side by side, this time with the ranch's actual account receipts that she'd found in a box on the study shelf. Silas had told her she could use the study when he wasn't in it, which she'd taken as a significant concession, even if he hadn't meant it as one. She compared receipt dates to ledger entries, and she found something she hadn't noticed the first time. Every discrepancy in the cattle count corresponded to a date when a specific ranch hand, a man named Garrett, had been assigned to handle transfers alone. Not supervised. Not documented beyond a single line in the transfer log. Garrett was a quiet man in his mid-30s. She'd placed him as something like invisible in the daily running of the ranch, present at meals. Competent at his work, unremarkable in most ways. Nobody's enemy. Nobody's particular friend. The kind of man who doesn't attract attention because he's trying not to. She sat with the receipts spread across the study floor for 40 minutes. She thought about what she could prove and what she could only see. Then she went and found Pete. Pete was in the barn, working on a harness that had seen better years. He was the kind of man who took his time with things, which she'd found was usually either stubbornness or wisdom. And in his case was the second. "I have a question," she said, "and I need you to understand I'm not asking you to say anything about anybody. I'm just asking about a process." Pete looked up from the harness. He had eyes that had seen a lot of things and decided not to be surprised by most of them anymore. "All right," he said. "When cattle are transferred, moved between pastures, or sent to a broker for sale who normally handles the documentation." "Rourke, mostly," Pete said. "Sometimes whoever's senior on the transfer day." "Has Garrett done transfers?" A pause. Just a half second. But it was there. "He has," Pete said carefully. "Alone?" Another small pause. "A few times." When Rourke was short-handed, "Thank you," Clara said. She walked back to the house. She stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, not cooking. Just standing. She was thinking about the geometry of it, what she had, what she needed, what would happen if she was right versus what would happen if she was wrong. She was not a sheriff. She was not a lawyer. She was not even technically a full partner in this ranch's management. But she was paying attention. And right now, nobody else was. She went to find Wade Rourke. She didn't tell him everything. She wasn't ready for that, and more importantly, she wasn't sure yet how Wade felt about Garrett. Some men's loyalty was to the work. Some men's loyalty was to the people they'd worked alongside for years. Those were not the same thing, and they produced different outcomes in a situation like this. She told him instead that she'd found some irregularities in the transfer documentation and that she wanted to understand the transfer process better before she brought it to Silas. Rourke listened. Then he said, "Why are you bringing this to me?" "Because you're the foreman," she said. "And because if there's something wrong in how transfers are documented, you'd want to know before it becomes a bigger problem." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was making several calculations at once. "What kind of irregularities?" he said. "Dates that don't match between the ledger and the receipts," she said, "and a pattern to which dates they are." The muscle in his jaw moved. "Show me," he said. She brought him to the study. She laid out the documents, not all of them, just enough to show the pattern without naming Garrett directly. She let the numbers do the talking, because numbers don't have feelings, and they don't defend themselves, and they're very hard to argue with when they're lined up correctly. Rourke stood over the documents for a long time. He wasn't a stupid man. She'd suspected that from the beginning, and the way he moved through the papers confirmed it. He was looking for what she'd looked for, and he was finding the same things. When he finally straightened up, his face had closed down in a way she recognized the face of a man managing something difficult. "I need you to leave these with me," he said. "They're Silas's documents," she said. "I know that." "I'll give you copies of my notes," she said. "But the originals stay where they are." He looked at her. There was something behind his eyes' frustration, maybe, at being managed, which she understood. But he was a man who respected competence, and right now competence was what she was showing him. "Fine," he said. She made copies of her notes. She handed them to him. Most of it went dark. She told him she thought they should bring it to Silas together, and sooner rather than later, because Dane was coming back Thursday, and Silas needed to be thinking about one problem at a time. Rourke took the notes. "You've been here less than 2 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "And you found 2 problems that've been sitting here for months. I'm not saying that to embarrass anyone," she said. "I'm saying it because the problems exist and they need dealing with." He folded the notes and put them in his shirt pocket. "I misjudged you," he said. It was the directest thing he'd said to her that wasn't an argument. "You were making a reasonable assessment with limited information," she said. "That's not the same as a mistake." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "But Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. Victor Dane arrived at 10 in the morning, riding the same well-maintained horse in the same well-fitting coat, the same practiced warmth on his face, and a slightly different energy beneath it, the energy of a man who expected a signature and was building toward it before he dismounted. Clara had made a proper mid-morning spread, coffee, fresh bread, preserves. not elaborate, just present. A managed house, a working one. She didn't attend the meeting, she wasn't invited, and she didn't ask. But she stayed close. She heard the conversation shift when Silas said, "I've had the contract reviewed." A brief pause in Dane's voice. Just brief. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I expect nothing less from a careful man." "There are some clauses I want to discuss," Silas said. She listened to Silas work through it, her notes in his words, his voice calm and deliberate. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Something like pride, though not in herself exactly. More in the situation. In the fact that the conversation was happening at all. Dane deflected well. He was good at this. He had explanations for the improvement clause language. He said, "Nothing unusual, certainly not intended the way it might appear on first reading." Silas said, "What happens to the improvements at the end of the lease?" Pause. "They revert to the landowner." "Naturally," Dane said. "That's not what the contract says," Silas said. A longer pause. "We can certainly clarify the language," Dane said, and his voice had changed slightly, still warm, but with something tighter underneath it. "These are standard forms. Sometimes the language is—" "I'd like the clarification in writing before we discuss this further," Silas said. The conversation wound down shortly after. Dane promised revised language. He would return in a week, perhaps 2. He was gracious about it. He was always gracious. That was part of the machinery. She heard a man who had not gotten what he came for. She was at the stove when Silas came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "He'll be back," he said. "Yes," she said. "With different language." "Probably," she said. "Or possibly with different pressure. It depends on how much he wants this particular land." Silas was quiet. He looked like a man thinking through implications he hadn't finished mapping yet. "Why this ranch?" he said, more to himself than to her. "Why the Southern Territory specifically?" She turned the heat down on the stove. "That's a good question," she said. "The Southern Territory borders what?" He looked at her. "The Henderson property. And beyond that, the Alcott spread." She let that sit for a moment. He got there himself. If they leased all 3, they'd have a continuous corridor of grazing territory through the most productive section of the valley, she said, under a lease structure that could be converted to a standing claim. Silas's face changed. It was the first time she'd seen him look something close to alarmed. "They're not just after Ironwood," he said. "I don't think so," she said. "Henderson is barely holding on this year," he said. "Bad spring. Lost 24 head to a disease that came through in August. If someone came to him with a generous offer, he might sign without reading carefully," she said, "especially if he was desperate. Especially if the man offering it was good at his job." She handed him a coffee. He took it this time. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the light had the gray-gold quality of late afternoon in November, when the sun's going down too early and reminding everyone that winter was a matter of weeks, not months. "I need to talk to Henderson," Silas said. "Yes," Clara said. "You do. And I need to talk to Crowley again. About all of this. The contract," and he stopped. "The other thing. The cattle. And the other matter." "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a moment, holding the coffee. "You knew all of this was connected," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the flat statement of a man realizing something. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I noticed things that seemed like separate problems. I'm not sure yet whether they are. But you think they might not be." She looked at him. At the carefully controlled face that had been learning in small increments to let her see what was happening behind it. "I think," she said slowly, "that when you find a leak in one wall and a crack in another wall at the same time, it's worth checking whether they come from the same source." Silas set down the coffee. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the land at Ironwood, 1,200 acres of it, that he had built and worked and defended for years before she arrived. "I built this myself," he said, "not with pride, just with the factual weight of it, every piece of it." "I know," she said. "I don't like needing help. Most people who are good at things don't," she said. "That's not a flaw. It's just expensive sometimes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What do you need from me to keep looking into this?" She had thought about this. She'd thought about it carefully because the answer mattered, and she didn't want to ask for too much or too little. "Access to the account books," she said. "Not just the ledgers, the actual account records. And the ability to ask Pete and Cutter questions without them wondering whether they should answer me." I'll tell them, he said. And I need you to trust that if I find something you don't want to find, I'm going to tell you anyway. He turned from the window. I already know that, he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd given her, and they both understood it. That night, she found the third thing. It was in the account book, buried in the regular expenses, a series of payments to a supplier she didn't recognize. Small amounts, spread across 4 months, always in cash, always noted in the same handwriting. Routine on the surface. She checked the supply ledger. The deliveries corresponding to those payments didn't match anything that had come into the ranch house or the bunkhouse. She sat back. She thought about what deliveries would be paid for in cash, in small amounts, by someone who had access to the account book and would not appear anywhere in the physical inventory. She thought about Garrett. She thought about a man who takes a little at a time, not too much, just enough. Kuntweiss. She thought about the specific location of the Ironwood Southern Territory and a company that needed a continuous corridor through the valley, and what that corridor would be worth. She wrote it all down, every piece, carefully and without conclusion, because she didn't have enough yet for conclusions. She had patterns. She had suggestions. She had the shape of something she couldn't fully see. She closed the book. She sat in the study with the lamp turned low and the ranch quiet around her, and she felt the weight of what she was sitting in the middle of a problem that was bigger than a missing cattle count and a badly written lease, bigger than one ranch's internal dysfunction. She was not afraid exactly. She was clear this was the thing she was good at. Not cooking, though she was good at that too. The cooking was how she survived. This, the reading and the noticing and the patient assembly of pieces into pictures, this was something else. This was what her father had taught her in all those years of sitting in the land office reading documents that other people couldn't be bothered to understand. Pay attention, he used to say. Not to what people tell you, to what the paper tells you. People lie because they want to. Paper lies because someone made it, and someone making a lie always leaves something behind. She put out the lamp. She went to the kitchen, banked the stove for the night, and made sure the morning preparations were in order. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. And in the morning, before any man on the ranch was awake, she was already at the kitchen table with the account book open again, a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow, starting from the beginning, because somewhere in these pages was the rest of the picture, and she was going to find it. The account book gave her 3 more days of careful reading before it gave her anything definitive. During those 3 days, Clara cooked, managed the household, dealt with a bunkhouse dispute over a missing blanket that turned out to involve 4 men and a poker debt, organized the smokehouse curing with Cutter, ordered supplies through the general store in Dry Creek, and found time somewhere in the margins of all of it to sit with those numbers every night until her eyes burned. She was tired in a way that had layers to it. The surface tiredness was the work the early mornings, the late nights, the physical demands of feeding 18 men 3 times a day, with limited help. Beneath that was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from being constantly alert in a place where she was still, technically, a stranger. Couldn't afford to miss things. She couldn't afford the small mental vacations that people take when they feel safe. Every room she walked into, she was still being measured. Every meal, still being assessed. Even the men who had warmed to her Tommy Cutter, Old Pete, there was still a waiting quality to their warmth, like approval given on a trial basis. She understood it, she didn't resent it, but it cost something. That constant performance of competence in front of an audience that hadn't yet decided to fully trust her. She didn't say any of this to Silas. She said instead, on the 3rd evening, I found the broker. Most of its windows were dark. He looked up from the far end of the kitchen table where he'd taken to sitting after supper, going through his own papers, while she went through hers. It had become a habit without either of them deciding it would be one. In the account book, he said. In the account book, she said. The payments I found last week, the ones that don't match any delivery. They go to an outfit called Callaway Freight and Trade. But Callaway Freight and Trade doesn't appear anywhere in your regular supplier list, and when I cross-reference the dates. She turned the account book toward him and pointed. Every payment date falls within 4 days of a transfer date when Garrett worked alone. Silas looked at the page. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that's doing a lot of work. Callaway, he said. You know them? I know the name. They operate out of Casper. Small outfit, moves livestock, some freight. He paused. Nobody I've ever had reason to deal with. Garrett has, she said. Another silence. Silas sat back. He pressed his palm flat against the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just a man organizing what he was thinking and needing a second to do it without his face in the way. How many head? He said. Based on the payments at roughly market rate for that period, somewhere between 40 and 60 over 7 months, she said. I can't be more precise than that without knowing what price Calloway was paying him. 40 to 60 head. Clara watched Silas absorb it. It wasn't a catastrophic number for a ranch this size. It wasn't going to bankrupt Ironwood, but it wasn't nothing, and more than the money itself was the fact of it that a man who ate his food and worked his land and took his wage had been quietly helping himself to what wasn't his for the better part of a year. I want to talk to Rourke tonight, Silas said. He already suspects, she said. I think he's suspected longer than the numbers show. I think he didn't want to be right. Silas looked at her. Why didn't he come to me? Because coming to you with a suspicion about a man you've employed for 3 years without proof is a different thing than coming to you with numbers. She said it carefully because she wasn't trying to excuse Rourke, just explain the geometry of it. And maybe because he'd have to explain why he didn't catch it sooner. Silas's jaw tightened. He should have come to me. Yes, she said. He should have. She didn't add anything to that. Silas needed to be angry for a minute, and it was a reasonable anger, and she wasn't going to talk him out of it. She poured him a coffee and went back to her notes. Rourke came to the house at 9 that night, summoned by Tommy, who had learned to be a very effective and very discreet messenger in a short period of time. He sat down across from Silas. Clara stayed at the kitchen table. Nobody told her to leave. She took that as the arrangement being understood now, even if it hadn't been formally stated. Silas laid out the numbers. Rourke listened. His face went through several things, something that might have been relief at finally hearing it said out loud, something that might have been shame, and something at the end that settled into a hard, flat anger she recognized as the kind directed mostly inward. Caught it, Rourke said. Yes, Silas said. Same answer Clara had given, same plainness. I noticed some variation in the counts in July. I put it to weather stress, moving patterns. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I didn't want to start a thing without being sure. And after July, Silas said. Rourke didn't answer immediately. I was watching, he said finally. I just wasn't writing it down. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Clara had learned to read. That look, by now it was the face he made when he was deciding something that cost him. I need to know if you can handle what comes next, Silas said. Because what comes next isn't going to be easy. And I need my foreman with me, not managing his own feelings about having missed something. Rourke met his eyes. I'm with you. Good, Silas said. Then here's what we're going to do. What they were going to do, it turned out.
Required Edwin Crowley.
Crowley was Dry Creek's attorney, the only one within 40 miles in any direction, and he was a small, careful man of about 60, and Gnanif Chexty, who wore reading glasses, had the particular quality of a man who had been underestimated so many times that he no longer bothered to correct people about it. Silas brought Clara with him to Crowley's office, which surprised her. She didn't ask why. She sat in the chair to Silas's left and kept her notes in her lap and let Silas lead the conversation, which he did competently, laying out the cattle situation first, and then the contract problem, and then what Clara had found connecting the dates and the broker. Crowley listened without interrupting. He had his reading glasses on, and he was making small, precise notes on a pad in handwriting, so small it looked like code. When Silas finished, Crowley looked at the notes Clara handed him. He read them the way she read things top to bottom, then back, then diagonally, across looking for something specific. Where did you learn to document like this? He said to her. My father was a land clerk, she said, in Pennsylvania. Harrisburg? Yes. He looked at the notes again. Thomas Vance? She stared at him. You knew my father? We corresponded, Crowley said, with the mild pleasure of a man producing an unexpected connection. Professional matters. A property dispute that crossed state lines in 71. He was thorough. He looked at her over the glasses. You're more thorough. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. Crowley turned back to Silas. The cattle matter is actionable. You have enough documentation to confront the man directly, and enough to take to a territorial court if needed. My recommendation is to confront him privately first, with a witness Rourke, since he's him the option to provide an accounting and make restitution. He paused. He may bolt. Be prepared for that. And the contract? Silas said. Don't sign it, Crowley said flatly. Not in its current form. The improvement clause is, he stopped. Set down the contract. It's not accidental. That language is specific enough to have been written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Meaning it's deliberate, Silas said. Meaning it's deliberate, Crowley agreed. And Frontier Dominion Holdings is not a name I'm unfamiliar with. I've seen this company's paperwork before, in a matter involving a ranch north of here about 2 years ago. He picked up his pen. The case didn't go anywhere. The landowner sold before it got to court. Clara said, "What did the landowner's contract look like?" Crowley looked at her. "I'd have to pull the file. I'd like to see it," she said. "If you're willing." Crowley looked at Silas. "Pull the file," Silas said. The file from 2 years ago was thinner than Clara hoped and more useful than she expected. She sat in Crowley's office for 3 hours going through it, while Silas handled ranch business in town, and Crowley answered to other clients. The previous case involved a man named Aldrich who had owned a spread east of Dry Creek, the Double Ranch, smaller than Ironwood, but occupying a significant piece of river-adjacent land. He'd been approached by a representative of Frontier Dominion with a lease offer. He'd signed without a lawyer. Within 14 months, the company had constructed a water diversion structure on the leased territory, a permanent structure, and when Aldrich tried to terminate the lease early due to the disruption to his pasture irrigation, they'd used the improvement clause to argue a standing interest in the land itself. Aldrich had run out of money before the case concluded. He'd sold to a private buyer at a significant loss. Clara noted the name of the private buyer. She cross-referenced it with nothing she had, because she had nothing to cross-reference it with. But she wrote it down anyway. Then she noted the name of the Frontier Dominion representative on the Aldrich paperwork. It wasn't Victor Dane, it was a man named H. Callow. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back through the contract Dane had presented to Silas. She found the fine print at the bottom of page 4, the authorized representative designation. H. Callow, Regional Director, Frontier Dominion Holdings. Victor Dane was the face. H. Callow was what was behind it. She wrote that down too. When Silas came back to collect her, she had 4 pages of additional notes and the particular focused stillness that came over her when pieces were assembling into a picture she could see the shape of. Same company, she said, when she was in the wagon heading back to Ironwood. Same contract structure, same clause. 2 years apart, different representative, same script. Silas drove and didn't say anything for a moment. The road was rough here, and he was managing the horse through a section so the ruts were deep. "They've done this before," he said. "More than once, I think," she said. "Crowley's case was 2 years ago. That doesn't mean that was the first." "And the Aldrich land," Silas said. "Who ended up with it?" "A private buyer," she said. "I have the name." "Crowley can probably find out more about who they are." "What's the name?" "Meridian Land Partners," she said. Silas said nothing. The wagon moved through the cold afternoon. After a few minutes, he said, "I've heard that name." She looked at him. "I don't know." In passing. Sometime in the last year. He was frowning. Rourke mentioned it maybe. Someone at the stockyard. "In what context?" "Land acquisition," he said slowly. "Someone said they were buying up territorial property through brokers." He paused. "I didn't think much of it at the time." Clara looked at the road ahead. "If Meridian Land Partners is related to Frontier Dominion Holdings," she said carefully, "then the scheme isn't just the lease. The lease is how they create the leverage. The real endpoint is acquisition. They drive the value down with a disputed claim, then come in as a separate entity and buy at the lowered price." The wagon hit a rut. The horses corrected without needing much guidance. Silas said after a long pause, "That's a sophisticated operation." "Yes," she said. "That's not a small outfit looking for a quick deal." "No," she said. "That's something that needed planning and money and people in the right places," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which is why I think we need Crowley to write to the Territorial Land Office before we do anything else. Because if there are people in the right places," she stopped. Silas looked at her sideways. "Then some of those places might be official," he finished. Possible, she said. I don't know. But it's the kind of thing worth considering before we start telling people what we've found. Silas drove in silence for a while. You think carefully, he said finally. I try, she said. I get it wrong sometimes. What do you get wrong? She thought about it honestly. I trust the paperwork more than the people sometimes. Documents feel safer because they can't change their story. But documents can be made to say things too, if the person making them is good enough. I have to remind myself that the paper only shows me what someone chose to write down. He nodded slowly. What am I not writing down? He said, not rhetorical. A genuine question. She appreciated that. I don't know yet, she said. I don't think you're hiding anything from me. But there might be things you know that feel so ordinary to you that you don't think to mention them. Things about this territory, about the people in it, that could matter. Like Meridian land partners, he said. Like that, she said. So if things come back to you, tell me. Even small things? Especially small things, she said. Small things are usually where it starts. They dealt with Garrett on a Wednesday. It was Silas and Rourke who handled the direct confrontation in the barn, away from the other men. Clara was not present. She had made it clear she didn't need to be, and privately she was relieved not because she was afraid of the confrontation, but because she knew some things needed to happen between men in a certain way, and her presence changed the dynamic in ways that wouldn't serve anyone. She stayed in the kitchen and made bread and waited. Tommy, who clearly knew something was happening but not what, stayed very close to the kitchen for an hour and a half, without being particularly useful. When Rourke came back, he came to the kitchen first. He stood in the doorway, that same doorway where he'd stood the bowl, where everything had started, and he looked at her with an expression that had too many things in it to name. He admitted it, Rourke said. All of it, she said. Enough, said he started small. Thought Silas wouldn't notice. He stopped, pressed his jaw together, said he'd been approached. Someone came to him, offered him a cut if he could keep quiet about certain discrepancies. Clara set down the bread she'd been working. Who approached him? He didn't know the man's name. Said it was someone who came through in the spring. Said he had connections to a land company. Said there was money to be made if Garrett could help make the ranch look less profitable on paper. She was very still, less profitable on paper, she repeated. That's what he said. She thought about the Aldrich case. About how a disputed land claim could lower a property's apparent value. About how a company that wanted to eventually acquire land at a reduced price might benefit from that land looking less valuable to outside observers or to a rancher who was being slowly drained and starting to doubt himself. Where is Garrett now? She said. Silas let him pack his gear. He's leaving before dark. Rourke paused. No charges. Silas wants the restitution documented and Garrett out, and no word of it going around until we understand more of what we're dealing with. That was the right call. Clara had thought Silas would make it, and she'd been relieved when Rourke confirmed it. Rourke, she said. He looked at her. He was approached in the spring, before I arrived, before anyone would have known I was going to find any of this. She let that settle, which means whoever came to Garrett was working with information about this ranch already. They knew the operation well enough to identify someone who might cooperate. Rourke was quiet. Someone who'd been here, he said slowly, or someone who had reason to know the staff, or someone with access to territorial records that list ranch employees, she said. Land office filings, labor registrations, things that exist on paper somewhere official. Rourke looked like a man who had just seen a room he thought was small turn out to have more doors than he'd counted. I need a drink, he said. Supper's in an hour, she said. That's the best I can offer. He almost smiled again, getting closer each time. November arrived with intention. The first real cold came in on a Tuesday, the temperature dropping 20 degrees between morning and afternoon, the sky turning the particular heavy gray that Pete said meant serious weather was thinking about it. Not here yet, but thinking. Clara had been thinking about winter since her first week at Ironwood. She hadn't said much about it because she didn't want to alarm anyone, and also because most of the things she was doing to prepare for it looked like ordinary household management and didn't need explaining. But she was tracking things. The firewood situation, not enough split wood for a hard winter, she'd addressed that by asking Tommy to organize a rotation. The lamp oil reserves too low, she'd ordered more. The medicinal supplies, which were nearly non-existent. She'd written to a contact in Cheyenne for a proper supply kit. She did an inventory of the food stores in the second week of November and came away feeling better than she'd expected. The smokehouse was working properly now, with Cutter's hams coming along and 2 additional batches of salt pork she'd put up herself. The root cellar was full. The dry goods were organized and adequately stocked for at least 2 months of hard conditions. She wasn't complacent about it. She just didn't panic about things she'd prepared for. What she was thinking about was the investigation, because the investigation had stalled in a way that frustrated her. Crowley had written to the Territorial Land Office requesting information on Frontier Dominion holdings and on the Aldrich land sale. 3 weeks later, he'd received a letter acknowledging receipt of the inquiry. Nothing more. No information. Just acknowledgement. That's slower than usual, Crowley told Silas when they visited his office the second week of November. Routine inquiries generally come back within 10 days. What does that mean? Silas said. Crowley took off his reading glasses and cleaned them, the habit of a man who used the action to buy time to think. Could mean nothing. The office is understaffed, and the territorial secretary has been dealing with a boundary dispute further north that's consumed significant resources. He put the glasses back on. It could also mean that our inquiry landed on a desk where it wasn't welcome. Clara said, "Is there someone at the land office who would have reason to protect Frontier Dominion's interests?" Crowley looked at her. "That's a serious suggestion." "I know," she said. "Is there a reason to rule it out?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have reason to rule it in either," he said carefully. "What I have is a delayed response, and 20 years of practicing law in this territory, which has taught me to notice when things move slower than they should. Then we need another way to get the information," she said. "What do you have in mind?" Silas asked. She had been thinking about this. Crowley should write to Henderson and Alcott directly. Not about Frontier Dominion, just a general inquiry from a neighbor, asking if they've had any unusual approaches from land companies recently. Keep it informal enough that it doesn't alarm anyone. "Why informal?" Silas said. "Because if Frontier Dominion has someone watching the territory," she said, "a formal legal inquiry goes through official channels. An informal letter between ranchers doesn't." Crowley nodded slowly. "That has merit, and we need to know about Meridian Land Partners," she said. "Not through official channels. Through someone who tracks land transactions privately. A title researcher, maybe, or someone in Cheyenne who handles private transfers." "I know a man in Cheyenne," Crowley said. "We were at the same law school 30 years ago. He handles estate work land transfers, private sales. If Meridian is active in this territory, he'd likely have encountered them." "Can you write to him quickly?" she said. "I can write today," Crowley said. Silas had been listening to this exchange with the particular quiet of a man who was learning to not feel managed by someone else running a meeting he was nominally in charge of. Clara was aware of that dynamic and kept conscious of it. She had a tendency, she knew, to take charge of a problem once she could see it clearly, and that tendency had gotten her into trouble before with people who felt bypassed. But Silas wasn't the kind of man who needed things run past him for the sake of his feelings. He needed things done correctly, that she could work with. "Write the letter," he told Crowley, "and the note to Henderson and Alcott. Today if you can." Crowley made a note. Then he looked up. "There's one more thing I should mention." They waited. "I had a visitor last week," Crowley said. "A man stopped by the office. Said he was looking for legal counsel regarding a property matter. Gave his name as Chambers." He paused. "But the description, and I realize I only have description to go on, matches someone I've heard described in connection with Frontier Dominion's regional operations." Another pause. He asked several questions about typical lease terms in this part of the territory, about which ranches were currently in good financial standing and which were not. Silence in the small office. "He was mapping it," Clara said. "That was my conclusion," Crowley said. "What did you tell him?" Silas said. "I told him I was ethically constrained from discussing other clients' matters, and that general territorial statistics were available through the land office." Crowley's expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes were not. He thanked me and left. "He knows we're in the area," Silas said. "He may," Crowley said. "Or he may have simply been doing routine intelligence gathering, and we're one of several ranches he's mapping. Question is whether our inquiry to the land office triggered anything." The three of them were quiet for a moment. Outside, Dry Creek went about its business boots on the boardwalk, a horse at the livery, the distant sound of the blacksmith. Ordinary things against which this conversation felt considerably less ordinary. "We move faster," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "We can't afford to wait for the land office to respond," she said. "We need what Crowley's Cheyenne contact knows, and we need it before Dane comes back with revised contract language and again." She looked at Silas. "And we need to know whether Henderson and Alcott have already been approached, because if they have, we need to be the ones talking to them before Frontier Dominion circles back." Silas looked at Crowley. Crowley said, "She's right. I'll ride out to Henderson tomorrow," Silas said. "I'll write to Cheyenne tonight," Crowley said. "I'll send it by the morning stage." They were standing to go when Crowley said, almost as an afterthought, "Mrs. Mercer, the notes you prepared on the contract language. May I keep a copy?" "I made one for you," she said, and took it from her satchel. He looked at it, then at her. "Your father would have been pleased," he said quietly. She didn't answer that. She just nodded and followed Silas out the door. 3 days later, the storm came in. It didn't come the way Pete had predicted thinking about it, considering approaching cautiously. It came the way bad weather sometimes does, faster than anyone expected, and with more intent. Tuesday morning was cold and gray. By Tuesday noon, the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, and the sky had turned the color of an old bruise. By 3 in the afternoon, the snow was coming down in a way that was less like weather and more like a decision the sky had made. Silas came to the house at 4, which was earlier than usual. "Henderson can't get a rider out," he said. "Roads are closing." "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough that we need to make sure the cattle are pulled in." He was already moving, already organizing in his mind the 14 different things a blizzard required. "I'll need all hands on livestock through tonight." "Go," she said. "I'll manage the house." He looked at her. "I've been ready for this for 2 weeks," she said. "Go." He went. She turned to Tommy, who was already looking at her with the eyes of someone waiting for orders. "Get me Cutter," she said. "And then I need you to find where Pete put the extra lamp oil, because we're going to need every lamp in this building working by nightfall." Tommy was gone before she finished the sentence. She moved to the larder and began a fast inventory in her head. What was there? What would be needed? How many men might end up in this house if the bunkhouse proved insufficient? She thought about heat. The main house had 2 fireplaces and the kitchen stove, and the stove was the most important because it could run through the night without someone managing it if she banked it correctly. She thought about the 18 men outside set in that weather. She thought about Silas. She went to work. By 6 that evening, the kitchen had 2 soups going, a bean pot simmering, cornbread in the oven, and enough coffee prepped to run through the night. She had every lamp in the main room and the dining room burning. She had the fireplaces in both rooms laid and lit. She had the medicine kit she'd ordered from Cheyenne 3 weeks ago, the one that had arrived last Friday, and which she'd organized carefully and put on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, precisely because she knew winter was coming open on the kitchen table. The first men came in at 7, cold enough that their hands were clumsy with their coat buttons. She put hot food in front of them and didn't ask any questions. By 8, 9 men were in the house. By 9:12, the bunkhouse was still functioning. Rourke had stayed out there with the others, who were managing the livestock rotation, but the house was warm and the food was there, and men who'd spent 5 hours in a blizzard moved. Toward warmth and food, the way water moved downhill. She moved through the house steadily, refilling, checking, adjusting the stove damper, bringing dry socks from the supply she'd thought to put in the bottom drawer of the linen closet 3 days ago when Pete's cloud reading had suggested something serious was coming. Inns were dark. Tommy sat in the kitchen doorway and watched her with an expression she didn't notice until she happened to turn around and see it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. You knew this was coming." "Pete knew it was coming," she said. "I just listened." "You prepared for it," he said. "Everything's just ready. Like you thought through every part of it." She set down the pot she was carrying and looked at him directly. "Tommy, it's a blizzard in Wyoming in November. The preparation isn't a miracle. Just paying attention to what's coming and doing the work before you need to." He nodded, looked at his hands. "My mother used to say something like that," he said. "Your mother sounds sensible," Clara said. Is she in Wyoming? Iowa, he said. I haven't been back in 2 years. Write to her, Clara said. In the morning. Before the next thing, he looked up at her. People think they'll do it when things slow down, she said, and things don't slow down. Right when you have something to say. She went back to the stove. And it was almost 10 o'clock. The soup reached to the good, thick version of itself. The men in various states of warmth and full stomachs and exhausted sleep when someone knocked on the door. Not a polite knock, a desperate one. The knock of someone who had been moving through a blizzard for long enough that their hands didn't work properly anymore. Clara was closest. She got there before anyone else moved. She opened the door. The man on the porch looked like he had been assembled from snow and bad decisions. He was perhaps 40, with a face that had been through something recent and considerable. His coat was wrong, for this weather good quality once, but not adequate now. He was shaking in a controlled way, which meant he had enough strength left to manage the shaking, but not much beyond that. He had an envelope in his right hand, held with the particular grip of someone who had made a decision to hold on to something and kept that decision even when the rest of their body was considering giving up. He looked at her. Ironwood Ranch, he said. And it wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. I need Silas Mercer, he said. He's with the cattle, she said. Come inside. He hesitated. Come inside, she said again, with the tone she used when something was not optional. He came inside. She got him to the kitchen and got a blanket over his shoulders and put hot coffee in his hands and let him sit for 3 minutes without talking. Because people who were that cold didn't process language correctly, and it was a waste of everyone's time to start conversation before his temperature came up enough to matter. The envelope was still in his hand. After 3 minutes, she said, What's your name? He looked at her. His eyes were clearer. The coffee was working. Merrick, he said. Merrick Sloan. She knew that name. Garrett had mentioned it. In the conversation, Rourke had relayed a name that had come up in connection with the cattle broker. Not a central name. A peripheral one. A man who had worked briefly at Ironwood the previous spring and then left, or been let go, or both. Kept her face even. All right, Merrick, she said. What's in the envelope? He looked at it, then at her. Everything, he said. She didn't open the envelope. That was the first decision, and it cost her something, because every part of her that had been running on instinct and attention for the past 3 weeks wanted to know what was inside it. But Merrick Sloan was sitting in her kitchen, shaking the last of the cold out of his hands, and she didn't know him well enough yet to know what kind of man he was. And she needed Silas here before anything else happened. She sent Tommy to the barn. While they waited, she fed Merrick. Not because she was being generous, she was being practical. A man who had walked through a blizzard on whatever errand had brought him here needed food before he was going to be coherent enough to be useful, and right now coherent was what she needed him to be. She put a bowl of soup in front of him, and bread alongside it, and refilled his coffee, and sat down across the tuftle and watched him eat with the quiet attention of someone taking inventory. He was not what she'd expected from the peripheral mentions of his name. She'd built a picture, unconsciously, from what Rourke had said, a man who'd left under some kind of cloud, whose name came up in connection with the Garrett situation in ways that weren't entirely clear. She'd imagined someone harder, more used up. Merrick Sloan was neither of those things, or rather he had been both, and had come out the other side of it into something she couldn't quite categorize. He ate like a man who wasn't sure when he'd eat again, but was trying not to show it. How far did you walk, she said. He looked up. From the Callaway staging post. About 7 miles. In this, she said. I didn't know it was going to be this, he said. I knew it was going to be cold. Why not take a horse? He was quiet for a moment. Because a horse can be tracked, he said. And I needed to get here without anyone knowing I'd left. She let that sit without following it immediately. She had questions, but she had enough experience with frightened people to know that the right question at the wrong moment closed things down instead of opening them. She refilled his coffee. You worked here before, she said. Last spring. He looked at her with something careful in it. Yes, you left. I was let go, he said, or close enough. By Rourke? By the situation, he said. Rourke didn't have to say much. She was considering how to continue that thread when the back door opened and Silas came in with snow on his shoulders and the cold still on his face and Rourke 2 steps and the kitchen went from quiet to suddenly very full. Silas looked at Merrick. Merrick looked at Silas. The silence between them had history in it. Merrick Sloan, Silas said. His voice was controlled. Clara had come to recognize the specific quality of Silas's controlled voice. It was the one he used when something was costing him more than he wanted to spend. Mr. Mercer, Merrick said. He didn't stand. Whether that was exhaustion or something more complicated, she couldn't tell. Rourke had stopped in the doorway. He was looking at Merrick with the expression of a man who has spent months being quietly angry at someone and is now confronted with that someone and finds the anger doesn't quite land the way he'd planned. "What are you doing at my ranch?" Silas said. Merrick looked at the envelope on the table. He'd set it down when the soup arrived, and Clara had not touched it, and now all of them were looking at it. "I came to give you that," Merrick said. Silas didn't look at the envelope. He kept looking at Merrick. "Why?" Merrick set down his spoon. He folded his hands on the table in the careful way of a man deciding to be honest and bracing for what honest costs. "Because I've been doing work for Callaway for 8 months," he said. "Freight coordination, mostly. Moving livestock through their distribution chain." He paused. "I knew some of that livestock was coming off Ironwood. I didn't ask questions I didn't want answered. I told myself it wasn't my business." Silas said nothing. "Then 4 months ago, a man named Callow came through the Callaway operation," Merrick said. "He wasn't there for the livestock. He was there for information. He wanted records which ranches were selling through Callaway, which ones had employees willing to provide access, which properties in the territory had financial vulnerabilities." Merrick looked at his hands. "I started keeping my own copies." "Why?" Silas said. "Because the way Callow talked about those ranches." He stopped, looked for the right word, and didn't quite find it. He talked about them like they were already gone. Like the families on them were just inconvenient details. He looked up. "I've worked ranches my whole life. I know what it takes to build something like this." And this man was talking about it like it was a real estate transaction, and the people were furniture. Kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind doing its work against the house. "So you kept copies," Clara said. "Everything I could get to," he said. "Payment records, correspondence, names." Callow had a contact at the Territorial Land Office. I don't have his name, but I have 2 letters that went through our office that reference him. Someone who was delaying inquiries, flagging certain legal activities for Frontier Dominion before they became public record. Clara felt something go very still inside her. "Let me see the envelope," she said. Silas looked at her. Then he picked up the envelope and handed it to her. She opened it at the kitchen table, with Silas and Rourke watching, and Merrick watching too, and she went through it the way she went through everything carefully, in order, not skipping ahead even when she wanted to. There were 11 documents inside. Payment ledgers from Callaway, showing transactions coded by ranch identifier. She recognized Ironwood's by the dates and amounts, which matched what she'd found in the account book. 3 other ranch identifiers she didn't recognize, but could probably map to properties in the territory. A letter on Frontier Dominion letterhead addressed to H. Callow from someone who signed only with initials D. W. Authorizing an accelerated timeline on territory consolidation in this region. 2 letters that referenced a territorial official only as our friend at the office, one of which included a specific instruction to delay responses to land inquiry letters for at least 30 days. And at the bottom, a list of names. 7 ranches, their approximate acreage, their perceived financial status, their current negotiation stage with Frontier Dominion. 2 had already signed lease agreements. 3 were in active negotiation. 1 was listed as resistant alternative pressure being considered. The 7th was Ironwood, listed as contract pending investigation risk elevated. Investigation risk elevated. She set the papers down. "They know we've been looking into them," she said. Silas looked at the list. His face did the thing it did when something cost more than he'd budgeted for. "How current is this?" Merrick said the list is dated 3 weeks ago. "And the letter about accelerated consolidation?" 2 weeks. Clara looked at the 2 signed lease agreements. "Do you know which ranches these are?" "I only know their codes," Merrick said. "But I can tell you the Callaway staging posts they use. Someone who knows the territory could probably work out which properties they correspond to." Rourke said from the doorway, where he'd been standing through all of this with his arms crossed and his face doing complicated things. The Harmon spread uses the Callaway Post on the North Road. He paused. And if I had to guess on the other one, I'd say Whitfield. He was having a hard year. I saw him in town in September, and he looked like a man who'd already decided something he didn't feel good about. 2 ranches already under Frontier Dominion leases, Clara said. 3 in negotiation. And if what I found in Crowley's files is right, those leases are structured to eventually allow acquisition. She looked at Silas. This is not a scheme about Ironwood. Ironwood is one piece of something much larger, a corridor through the territory, Silas said. He'd said it before. In the wagon, and she'd confirmed it then, but now there was proof of it on the kitchen table, and it landed differently. A corridor they're building systematically, she said, using employees they've compromised, contract language they've refined from previous operations, and at least one official who's protecting them from scrutiny. She looked at Merrick. Is Callow still in the territory? As of 4 days ago, Merrick said. He was at the Callaway main office in Casper. He was planning to come back through this region before the end of the month. Silas looked at the blizzard doing its work against the kitchen window. We need Crowley, he said. In the morning, Clara said, when the roads are passable. She looked at the documents. Tonight we organize what we have and make sure we understand all of it before we put it in front of anyone. Where does Merrick stay? Rourke said. She looked at Merrick. Question of what Merrick Sloan was in this situation was not simple. He had done wrong, she was clear about that, and she thought he was clear about it too. He'd known where that livestock came from, and he'd kept his head down and done his work, and told himself some story. People tell themselves when they're doing something they know is wrong, but can't find the edge of where to stop. That was a human failing and not a rare one. It didn't make him a good man. It didn't make him unredeemable either. More practically, he had walked 7 miles through a blizzard to deliver documents that could protect 7 ranches and expose an organized property scheme, and right now he was the only person in this room who had seen Callow's operation from the inside. He stays here tonight, she said. Tommy can double up. Rourke looked like he was going to say something and then decided against it. That itself was a kind of progress. They worked at the kitchen table until past midnight. Clara organized the documents, cross-referencing them against her own notes, against the contract language from the Aldrich case that she'd brought home from Crowley's office, against the account book entries she'd been living with for weeks. She built a chronology on 5 sheets of paper, the timeline of Frontier Dominion's operations in this territory, as it could be reconstructed from everything they now had. Silas worked beside her, not directing the process, but not absent from it either. He read every document she passed him, asked questions that were good ones, made 2 corrections to her timeline based on things he knew about the territory that she didn't local details, the timing of certain events she'd placed slightly wrong. It was the most they'd talked in a single sitting since the night with the original contract. At one point, somewhere around 11, he said without looking up from the document he was reading, "You've done this kind of thing before. Not just reading contracts, this." He gestured vaguely at the spread of organized papers. Assembling it. She considered how to answer that honestly. My father used to say the land office was where people came when they were desperate and scared and didn't understand what was happening to them. And the paperwork was usually where the answer was, if you could read it right. She paused. I used to help him explain things to people. What they'd signed, what it meant, what their options were. I got good at finding the shape of a problem in documents. Why didn't you keep doing it? He said. Women don't typically work in land offices in Pennsylvania, she said dryly. He looked up at her then. Something in his expression that wasn't quite an apology, but was in that neighborhood. After my father died, she said, I managed the boarding house. It was work I could get. It wasn't what I was good at. She looked at the papers. This is what I'm good at. Silas was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, you're also good at the other things. The cooking, she said. The cooking, the running of this place. The way you handled the men. He paused, and she could see him working against some habitual reluctance to say things directly. I wrote an honest advertisement because I wanted someone capable. I underestimated what capable might look like. She looked at him across the lamp. Most people do, she said. I found it's easier to let them. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the document in his hand. They finished the chronology at 12:30. Rourke had fallen asleep in the chair by the main room fireplace somewhere around 11, which Clara had observed and said nothing about, because he'd been up since before dawn and had spent 6 hours in a blizzard and was 50% more useful asleep than he was awake and resentful. Merrick had been given a blanket and the floor of Tommy's room, which he'd accepted with the quiet of a man who understood he wasn't in a position to request better. Clara and Silas sat with the finished chronology between them and the lamp burning low. 7 ranches, Silas said. That we know of, she said. There may be others they're in earlier stages with. The 2 who've already signed. Harmon and Whitfield, if Rourke's right. Their leases are already active, which means the clock on the improvement clause is already running. She looked at the papers. They need to know what they've signed. But we need to be careful about how we tell them. Because if Frontier Dominion hears that their existing leaseholders are getting legal advice, they accelerate, Silas said, or they cut their losses on those 2 and focus on completing the others, she said. We need Crowley to advise on the sequence. He'll know better than I do what's legally necessary and in what order. Silas looked at the chronology. How did you know? He said. From that first night when you went through the supply ledger, how did you know there was something to find? She thought about this. I didn't know, she said. I noticed things that didn't fit, and I've learned that things that don't fit are worth following, because usually something made them not fit. It doesn't always lead anywhere significant. She paused. This time, it led somewhere more significant than I expected. He stopped. Started again. Are you all right with all of this? Question surprised her. Not because it was a strange question, but because Silas Mercer asking it felt like a different kind of moment than the ones they'd been having. I'm tired, she said honestly, but I'm all right. You've been carrying a lot of this alone, he said. I had the documents to keep me company, she said. The faintest edge of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but its predecessor. That's not the same thing, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. They sat quietly for a moment with the blizzard outside and the lamp between them and the evidence of something complicated spread across the table. Clara, he said. He'd started using her name perhaps a week ago, and it still had the quality of something being tried carefully, like a word in a language he was still learning. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, simply. No architecture around it. She looked at the papers. At 1,200 acres of ironwood outside the walls of this house, in the dark and the snow. It's my home, too, she said, for whatever that's worth. He was quiet for a moment. It's worth a good deal, he said. Most of its windows were dark. The roads cleared enough by Thursday morning for a wagon to get to Dry Creek, and Silas went to Crowley's office while Clara stayed at the ranch and managed what needed managing. The morning after a blizzard at a working ranch was not a small thing. 3 sections of fencing on the north pasture had come down under the snow weight. 2 of the younger hands had minor frostbite on their hands from the night's work. The bunkhouse had a leak that hadn't been there before, which Tommy found at 6 in the morning and came to tell her about with the expression of someone reporting a death. She sent him back with a bucket and told him to document where exactly the water was coming in and that they'd deal with it properly. In the spring, she made extra food for the morning because men who had worked through a blizzard needed more than ordinary breakfast to get upright, and she walked through the bunkhouse herself to check the 2 men with frostbite and apply what she had from the medical kit and remind them both to keep the affected fingers dry and warm for the next 48 hours. She did all of this, and then she came back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee and sat with it for the first time. Since Merrick Sloan had knocked on her door in the storm, and she let herself be still for 15 minutes because she needed it. Merrick was still on the property. That was a situation that required resolution. He wasn't a prisoner, and she wasn't going to treat him like one, but he also couldn't simply be out into the territory if Kalu's people were looking for him, which she suspected they might be once they noticed the documents were missing. She found him in the barn, which was where men tended to go when they didn't know where they belonged in a situation. He was helping Cutter with the horse care, not because anyone had asked him, but because he was the kind of man whose hands looked for work. You walked 7 miles in that storm, she said. He looked up from the horse he was brushing. I did. Were you followed? Not that I could tell. I left in the middle of the afternoon before the storm got bad. I don't think anyone saw which direction I went. Is there anyone at Callaway who knows what you were collecting? He was quiet for a moment, and in that pause, she saw someone taking careful stock of what was true versus what he wanted to be true. There's one man who might have noticed I was keeping my own records. A clerk named Briggs. He never said anything, but he had the look of someone filing information away. Another pause. Briggs has been with Calloway for 3 years. I don't know where his loyalty runs. Assume the worst, she said, which means assume someone knows you're gone and might guess where you went. Merrick looked at her steadily. All right. When Silas comes back from Crowley's, we're going to need you to sit down with both of them and go through everything you know about Callow's operation. Not just what's in the documents, what you observed, what you heard, the names you remember, the sequence of events as you experience them. She held his gaze. That's going to be uncomfortable. I know, he said. You're going to have to say what you did, she said, plainly, without making it sound better than it was. I know that too, he said. She studied him. She was making a decision she'd been making slowly since he'd appeared at her door, and she wanted to make it clearly, with her eyes open. What you did was wrong, she said. You knew livestock that wasn't yours was coming through that operation, and you kept working and kept quiet. That's not nothing. He didn't flinch from it. No, he said. It isn't. But what you brought here last night, if it's as useful as I think it is, it could protect a lot of people who had no part in any of this. I know, he said quietly. That's why I came. She was silent for a moment. I'm not the one who decides what happens to you, she said. Silas does, and Crowley will have a view. But I'll tell you honestly what I think. She looked at him directly. I think the right testimony from someone who was inside that operation is worth more than a wrong punishment for the person giving it. And I think Crowley will think so too. She paused. But I can't promise you anything. Merrick was quiet. I didn't come here for promises, he said. I came because it was the right thing to do. I've been not doing the right thing for 8 months, and I'm tired of how that feels. She looked at him for another moment. All right, she said. Stay in the barn until Silas gets back. Stay out of sight if anyone rides in you don't recognize. Silas returned from Dry Creek at 2 in the afternoon, with Crowley in the wagon beside him, and an expression that told her the meeting had covered significant ground. They went to the study, all 4 of them, Silas, Crowley, Clara, and Merrick, who Silas had agreed to hear out with a tightness around his eyes that said it cost him something to be in the same room as a man connected to his missing cattle. Crowley went through the documents with his reading glasses and his small, precise handwriting and the complete attention of a man who understood he was looking at something important. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the desk and looked at the documents spread in front of him. "This is enough," he said. "For what?" Silas said. "For a federal inquiry," Crowley said. He looked at Clara's chronology. She'd brought it with her, clean copy, organized by date and source. This is the kind of documentation that a federal investigator can use. The combination of the payment records, the internal correspondence referencing a territorial official, and the contract pattern across multiple properties. He paused. This isn't a local matter anymore. What does federal mean for timeline? Clara said. Slower in some ways, faster in others. Crowley looked at his notes. The territorial channels are compromised or potentially compromised, given what these letters suggest about her friend at the office. Federal inquiry bypasses those channels entirely. He looked at Silas. I have a contact, a man named Cross. He handles land fraud investigations for the federal office out of Cheyenne. I've worked with him before on a timber rights case. He paused. He's careful, he's thorough, and he does not have patience for the kind of operation these documents describe. Can you reach him? Silas said. I can write today and send by the fastest stage available, Crowley said. But Silas, while we wait for federal response, we need to keep this contained. No word to anyone we don't absolutely have to tell. He looked around the room. The territorial official who's protecting them doesn't know what we have. As long as they don't know, we have an advantage. Henderson and Whitfield, Silas said. Armin, the ranchers who've already signed or are in negotiation. We need to reach them carefully, Crowley said. Individually, not through any official channel. You ride to them personally, Silas, neighbor to neighbor, and you bring the contract information only. Not the full picture, not yet. Just enough to make them pause. And if they've already been too far compromised, Clara said. Crowley looked at her. Then we work with what we have, and hope federal moves fast enough. He picked up the letter referencing the territorial official. This is the piece I'm most concerned about. If the wrong person hears we're building a case before Cross can get here, they move the operation, Clara said. Or they move Callow out of the territory. Or they take steps to discredit the evidence, Crowley said carefully. He looked at Merrick, or the witness. Merrick met his gaze without flinching. I understand, Merrick said. Then you need to stay at Ironwood until Cross arrives, Crowley said. Not because you're required to, but because you're the only person who can testify to what happened inside Calloway's operation. And that testimony is what puts Callow in front of a federal judge, rather than simply shutting down one regional office while the rest of the operation continues. Rourke, who had been standing at the back of the study with his arms crossed in the way that meant he was processing something he hadn't finished with yet, said, If someone comes looking for him, we say we haven't seen him, Clara said. Rourke looked at her. It's a blizzard, she said. A man on foot in a blizzard in November in Wyoming. That's not a story anyone will question. Rourke's arms uncrossed slightly. He looked at Silas. Silas was looking at Clara with the expression she'd come to know as the one he had when he was deciding whether to be surprised by something or simply accept that this was the situation he was in. He turned to Crowley. Write the letter to Cross today. I'll ride to Henderson tomorrow if the road holds. He looked at Rourke. Keep the extra horse in the back barn. If anyone asks, we're managing storm damage. Rourke nodded, and Merrick Silas turned to him. The room held its breath for a moment. You'll be given a bunk and work while you're here. We don't run a hotel. He paused. But you're not a prisoner either. You came here when you didn't have to. I'm taking that into account. Merrick looked at him. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Don't thank me yet, Silas said. When Cross gets here, you're going to have to say everything you told us in front of a federal investigator under oath, and some of it's going to make you look exactly as bad as you were. He held Merrick's gaze. But if your testimony breaks this thing open, I'll say so. In writing, to whoever needs to hear it. The room was quiet. Outside, the snow was still on the ground, but the sky had cleared to the pale, hard blue of a Wyoming winter, morning after a storm, and the light came through the study window at an angle that made everything on the desk cast long, sharp shadows. Clara looked at the chronology she'd built. 11 documents, 7 ranches, 1 corrupt official, a land company with a practice system for stripping people of property they'd spent their lives building. She thought about the Aldrich family, whoever they were, wherever they'd gone after selling that ranch at a loss 2 years ago. She thought of the desperate on a document, a desperate signature on a fully read, because the man across the table was good at his job, and you needed the money, and it felt like the only option. She thought about the first day she'd arrived here. 2 suitcases and 3 recipe books standing in a Wyoming wind while no one came to meet her. She had not come here to investigate a land fraud scheme. She'd come here to make herself useful in a household that needed managing. And then useful had turned out to mean something considerably larger than anyone, including her, had anticipated. Crowley was already reaching for his pen. Silas was looking at the documents with the face of a man who had built something he was not going to let anyone take. Clara picked up the chronology and made one small addition at the bottom, a note she'd been meaning to add, the date Merrick Sloan had knocked on the door, and what he'd brought with him. Every story needed its full record. She was still the one keeping it. Crowley's letter reached Nathaniel Cross in Cheyenne on a Monday. By Friday of that same week, Cross was on a stage heading north. Clara didn't know any of this while it was happening. She was managing Ironwood through the aftermath of the blizzard, which turned out to be a considerable project on its own. The fencing repairs on the North Pasture took 4 days and 2 trips to the hardware supplier in Dry Creek. The bunkhouse leak was worse than Tommy had initially reported, not 1 weak point but 3, in a section of roof that had been patched rather than properly repaired the previous spring. She documented it, got an estimate from a carpenter in town, and presented it to Silas with the straightforward manner she'd adopted for household matters. Here is the problem. Here is what it costs to fix it correctly. Here is what it will cost if we don't. Silas approved it without argument. That was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He was not a man who made decisions slowly when the information was clear. He could be stubborn. She'd learned stubborn in the way of someone who had operated alone for long enough. that other people's input felt like interference even when it wasn't. But when she gave him clear information, he used it. He didn't second-guess her assessments or ask her to justify things she'd already justified. He just decided and moved. She thought about this sometimes, in the evenings when the ranch was quiet and she was at the kitchen table finishing her notes. She thought about what she'd expected when she stepped off that stagecoach. She'd expected to be tolerated. She'd expected to be useful in a narrow way, to manage a household and feed men and stay in her designated lane and find whatever small satisfactions were available within those limits. She had not expected to become, in the space of 2 months, someone whose judgment was sought and trusted on matters that had nothing to do with cooking. It was not something she'd planned for. She didn't know entirely what to do with it. She went about her work and let the feelings sit. Silas rode to Henderson's ranch on the Thursday after the storm. He came back that evening with his coat still cold and his expression more complicated than when he'd left. Henderson had already been approached. Not by Dane, a different representative, a woman which Clara found interesting, and which she filed under things worth noting. The offer Henderson had received was structured slightly differently: a short lease term, lower payments, the improvement clause buried even deeper in the language. Henderson had not signed, but he'd been close. He told Silas he'd been planning to sign by the end of the month. Silas had shown him the Aldrich case summary that Crowley had prepared. He'd shown him the contract comparison, Ironwood's original offer against Henderson's laid side by side, the same clause in different clothing. He hadn't shown him the full documents from Merrick, because Crowley had said to hold those until Cross arrived. Henderson had gone quiet for a long time. Then he'd said he needed to call his wife in from the other room. She'd read the contract comparison in about 4 minutes, and then looked up and said, in a voice but is very calm and very cold, "We almost lost this place." Silas told Clara this at the kitchen table that evening, and Clara saw something cross his face when he relayed the wife's words, something that took her a moment to identify, and then she recognized it as the particular discomfort of a man, recognizing himself in a situation he'd only narrowly escaped. "He's going to Alcott tomorrow," Silas said. "He wanted to ride himself, tell his own neighbor himself. I let him." "That was right," she said. "He also said." Silas paused. He was looking at the table. He said he'd heard Frontier Dominion had approached 2 other ranches south of Dry Creek that I wasn't aware of. Small operations, newer families. He paused again. "One of them has a sick child, medical debt." The representative knew about it when she made the offer. The kitchen was quiet. Clara set down her cup. "They researched their targets," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd suspected it, but hearing it confirmed that someone had walked up to a family with a sick child and made an offer calibrated to their specific desperation produced a cold, clear anger. She kept very still inside herself. "They knew Henderson's spring losses," Silas said. "They knew my cattle numbers were off. They knew Whitfield's debt situation." He looked at her. "Someone has access to information that isn't public. The official," she said. "Has to be." She thought about the letter in Merrick's documents our friend at the office, instructed to delay inquiries and flag certain properties. Person with access to financial records, to loan applications, to the private business of families who trusted official channels to be what they appeared. She thought about how angry she was, and she thought about how anger was only useful if it was pointed at something actionable. "When Cross gets here," she said, "the official is the first conversation. Before Callow, before Frontier Dominion's corporate structure, before the contracts. Because without that official, they don't have their intelligence network. And without the intelligence network, the whole targeting system falls apart." Silas looked at her. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I've been thinking about the sequence," she said. "The order things need to happen in to produce the most complete result. Because if we only stop this in this territory, they move the operation somewhere else. Done it before. The Aldrich case wasn't their first either. I'd put money on that." She looked at her notes. The way the contract language has evolved between the Aldrich case 2 years ago and now it's been refined. Someone with legal training worked on it. They learned from the parts that didn't work, so they need to be stopped at the level of the organization, not just the region, Silas said. Cross would need to recommend that to whoever he reports to, she said. We can make that case if we have everything organized clearly. She turned to a new page in the management book. Tell me everything Henderson told you, she said. Every detail, even the parts that seem small. Silas told her, she wrote. They were at the table until 11. Nathaniel Cross arrived at Dry Creek on a Saturday, 12 days after Crowley's letter had left. He was not what she'd expected. She'd formed a picture from the word federal official, formal, probably imperious in the way of men who came from cities and viewed territories as administrative problems. Cross was perhaps 50, with a lean, practical build, and the eyes of someone who had been lied to many times in a professional capacity and had become good at detecting it. He dressed like a working man who had made one or two concessions to his official role. He shook hands like someone who had decided a long time ago that grip was not the same thing as character. Crowley brought him to Ironwood rather than having them come to town, which Clara had suggested because she wanted Cross to see the ranch before he saw the documents. She wanted him to understand what was being protected before she showed him the evidence of what had been threatening it. Cross sat at the dining room table, not the kitchen table, this time, because this was the kind of meeting that needed a larger surface, and Clara put coffee and bread in front of him and then sat down herself and waited. Cross looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who had expected to be introduced and had not been. Crowley said, Mrs. Mercer has been conducting the document analysis and building the evidentiary record throughout this investigation. Cross looked at her for a moment. How much of what I'm about to see comes from you? The organization of it, she said. The original documents are partly from the Aldrich case file Crowley had, partly from ranch records I found irregularities in, and partly from Mr. Sloan, who was inside the Callaway operation. She paused. I built the chronology and the cross-referencing. Cross looked at Crowley. Crowley said simply, she's thorough. Read the chronology first. Cross read the chronology. He read it the way she'd written it, in order, with the source notations in the margin, the document references matching the numbered exhibits she'd arranged in a separate stack. He didn't take notes while he read. He was the kind of reader who absorbed first and wrote later. She recognized the type. When he finished, he looked up. How many ranches total? He said. 7 we can document, she said. Possibly more in earlier stages that we don't have visibility into. The territorial official, we have 2 letters referencing him by position, but not name, she said. We have Merrick Sloan's testimony that Callow communicated directly with someone at the office, and we have the documented delay in response to Crowley's official inquiry, which is 41 days past the standard response window. That delay alone isn't enough, Cross said. No, she agreed. But in combination with the letters, and in combination with the specificity of the financial intelligence, Frontier Dominion had on their targets information that isn't publicly available. There's a pattern that warrants examination of who had access to those records. Cross looked at her steadily. You've prepared for someone to push back on the official angle. I've prepared for someone to push back on everything, she said. I'd rather be ready for it. Something shifted in Cross's expression. Not quite approval, he was not the kind of man who dispensed approval easily. More like recalibration. He turned to the document stack. Walk me through it, he said. She did. It took 3 hours. Merrick's interview with Cross happened in the study, with Crowley present and Silas standing at the back of the room. Clara waited in the kitchen. She had not been invited, and she understood why Cross-eyed needed Merrick's account unmediated, without the presence of the person who'd been organizing and interpreting that account for 2 weeks. She made lunch and waited and tried not to listen, which was difficult because the study was directly off the main hallway. She heard Merrick's voice, steady and without apparent evasion. She heard Cross's questions, which were precise, and showed he'd read the documents carefully. She heard one moment of extended silence that lasted long enough that Tommy, who was washing dishes nearby, looked at her with slightly wide eyes. She shook her head at him. Not our business right now. At 2 in the afternoon, Cross came to the kitchen. He sat down at the table, her table, the kitchen table, where all of this had effectively started, with a supply ledger and a set of numbers that didn't match, and accepted the coffee she put in front of him. Mr. Sloan is a credible witness, he said. Yes, she said. He's also a man who was complicit in livestock theft from this property. Yes, she said again, he knows that. He said so. What do you think his motivation is for coming here? She considered the question honestly. I think it started with guilt, she said. And I think it progressed to something more like he needed to do the right thing badly enough that he walked 7 miles in a blizzard to do it. She paused. I don't think those are incompatible motivations. Most people who do the right thing after doing something wrong are motivated by both. Cross looked at her. What happens to him, she said, after? That depends on how his testimony holds and what the prosecuting office decides to prioritize, Cross said. My recommendation will be toward cooperation credit, rather than prosecution, given the value of what he's provided. He paused. That recommendation carries weight, but isn't a guarantee. I know, she said. I told him that. He said you did. Cross looked at his coffee. He also said you were the one who made the decision to keep him here. Silas made that decision, she said. He said it was yours. She looked at the table for a moment. I presented the case for it, she said. Silas decided. Cross studied her. That's an important distinction to you. It's an accurate distinction, she said. I'm not trying to be modest. I'm trying to be precise, all right. He drank the coffee. The Harmon and Whitfield leases, they're already active. Voiding them isn't straightforward. Okay. It requires demonstrating that the contracts were signed under fraudulent misrepresentation, which the documents support, but which will need to be argued before a court. Crowley anticipated that, she said. He's prepared to represent both ranchers if needed. Harmon has already agreed. Whitfield we haven't reached yet. Cross nodded, and the territorial official. Do you have a candidate? She said. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much to share and settling on honest. There are 2 people at the Territorial Land Office who had access to the financial records corresponding to the ranch's frontier dominion, targeted, he said. I've been aware of some irregularities in that office for the past 6 months, unrelated to this specific matter. What you've given me changes the context considerably. Clara absorbed that. You were already watching, she said. Watching, he said. Not yet moving. I didn't have enough. He looked at the chronology she'd laid on the table. Now I do. She looked at the window. Outside, the December light was flat and cold over the snow-covered ground of Ironwood Ranch. 1,200 acres that someone had wanted to take from a man who'd built every inch of it. What happens next? She said. I return to Cheyenne Monday, Cross said. I'll file the formal investigation request Tuesday. Given the multi-property scope, this will involve the federal district office, which means it moves through different channels than a territorial matter. He paused. It also means it's harder to obstruct at the local level. Timeline? 6 to 8 weeks before formal action against Frontier Dominion's regional operation. The official faster, if what I think is true turns out to be true. He looked at her. The existing leases are the most urgent matter. I'll file a temporary suspension order on both before I leave. That stops the clock on the improvement clause while the fraud case is built. She sat with that. The Harmon family and the Whitfield family, whose leases would be suspended Monday, who would be frightened and then confused, and then hopefully, eventually relieved. The other ranchers, she said, the ones still in negotiation. Henderson has already stepped back. Alcott Silas has ridden to Alcott today, Cross said. I suggested it before we started this morning. He went. A pause. He moves quickly when he understands a problem. Yes, she said. He does. Cross finished his coffee. He was preparing to stand. She could see it, and she had one more thing. The families with medical debt, she said. The smaller operations south of Dry Creek that Henderson told Silas about. The ones they were targeting because of specific vulnerabilities. She looked at him directly. They need to know someone's looking at this. They've been carrying the fear of losing their land without knowing there's a scheme behind it. That fear does real damage. Cross looked at her. What would you have me do about that specifically? He said. Not dismissive a genuine question. I'd have you, or Crowley, or someone with official standing, write to them before any of this becomes public through other channels, she said. Let them know what you know. Let them know the offer they received was fraudulent. Let them know they're not alone in this. She paused. People who feel alone in a desperate situation make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. Some of those decisions can't be undone. Cross was quiet. I'll write the letters, he said. The weeks that followed had the quality of aftermath, the strange suspended period, after the crisis has peaked, but before the results have finished arriving. Cross filed his suspension orders the Monday he left, as promised. Crowley received confirmation Wednesday. Harmon's lease was suspended. Whitfield's lease was suspended. Whitfield, when Silas rode out to tell him personally, had stood in his doorway with the expression of a man who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop for months and found out instead that someone had caught it in midair. His wife had cried, which Silas reported with some discomfort, being not entirely sure what to do with tears in a ranching context. "You handled it fine," Clara told him. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You went," she said. That was the thing. Victor Dane returned to Dry Creek in the second week of December. He went to Crowley's office first, which was probably a mistake on his part, and Crowley gave him a letter that Cross had prepared a formal notice of federal investigation into Frontier Dominion Holdings' territorial operations and a suspension of all pending lease negotiations pending that investigation. Dane's practiced warmth apparently did not survive contact with federal letterhead. He left Dry Creek the same day he arrived and did not come back. H. Callow was arrested in Casper in mid-December. Clara heard about it from Crowley, who came to the ranch with a letter from Cross. Callow had attempted to move certain documents out of the Calloway office the night before a scheduled search, which had been less intelligent than the operation he'd been running and had resulted in his arrest for obstruction and material evidence destruction, with the underlying fraud charges to follow. Territorial official, a man named Dawes, whom Clara had never met and whose name appeared in none of the documents, but was confirmed through Cross's parallel investigation, was placed on administrative suspension pending a formal inquiry. His name eventually appeared in a federal filing notice that Crowley showed her without comment. She read it, noted it, and filed it in the chronology. The ranchers south of Dry Creek, 2 families, the Pratts and the Emorys, received letters from Cross's office within 10 days of his departure from Ironwood, as he'd promised. Mrs. Pratt, whose youngest had been sick for 6 months with a lung condition, wrote a letter to Crowley's office that Crowley read to Clara in its entirety because he felt she had earned the right to hear it. The letter was not eloquent. It was the letter of a woman who was not practiced at formal correspondence and didn't try to hide it. She said they had been terrified and had been about to sign something she now understood would have eventually cost them their land. She said she didn't know how to thank whoever had been paying attention. Clara had to look at the window for a moment after Crowley finished reading. "You don't have to respond," Crowley said carefully. "I know," she said. She stopped, arranged herself. "I'm glad someone paid attention in time." Crowley folded the letter. "In matters like this, someone almost never does," he said quietly. "That's not false modesty. That's the ordinary reality of how these things usually go. Scheme succeeds, and the families lose their land. And eventually it ends up in the territory records as a completed transaction, and no one asks hard questions about how it happened." She looked at him. "This time was different because you found it," he said. "And because you knew what you were looking at when you found it." She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure what to do with it, honestly. She had not set out to be the person who found it. She had set to Zahoud and had set out to manage a household and had simply been herself in the process paying attention, treating problems as problems that could be solved if you approached them correctly. She supposed that was what her father had been trying to give her, all those years in the land office in Harrisburg, not just the skill of reading documents, but the habit of taking seriously what other people treated as background noise. Pay attention, not to what people tell you, to what the paper tells you. People lie because they want to. Paper lies because someone made it, and someone making a lie always leaves something behind. She'd found what was left behind. The letter from Cross's office arrived in February. Clara was in the kitchen, doing exactly what she'd been doing the morning. She first arrived at Ironwood working through inventory, comparing what she had against what she needed. She had improved the system considerably since October. The larder was organized in a way that made sense. The supply orders went in on a regular schedule. The waste was minimal. The men ate well. She heard Silas come through the front door. She heard him stop in the hallway, the particular stop and reading something standing up, which meant it was important enough not to wait. Then he came to the kitchen. He had the letter in his hand. She looked at him. "Cross wants to meet with us in Cheyenne in March," he said. "Both of us?" "Both of us," he said. He was looking at the letter. He paused, and she saw something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite discomfort. Closer to the expression of a man who is being asked to expand his idea of what a situation is. He says your document analysis of the contract patterns matches language found in fraudulent territorial agreements going back 7 years in 3 separate territories. He says the Federal Land Office has been trying to understand the structural pattern of these schemes for some time. She's set down the inventory sheet. He wants a formal consultation, Silas continued. He says. He looked at the letter again, and she had the impression he wanted to read it exactly rather than paraphrase it, because the exact words mattered. He read, Mrs. Mercer's analytical methodology and her documentation of the cross-property pattern represents exactly the kind of systematic review that federal investigators lack the time and specialized attention to. Conduct at the local level. He lowered the letter. He wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on other cases. On an ongoing basis, Clara stood very still. She thought about the land office in Harrisburg, where her father had worked for 11 years. She thought about the people who had come in desperate and scared and unable to understand what was being done to them. She thought about Merrick Sloan, walking 7 miles in a blizzard with an envelope because he'd run out of ways to live with himself. She thought about Mrs. Pratt's unpretentious letter, the one that had made her look at the window. She thought about the supply ledger, the numbers that didn't match, the first thread she'd pulled, not knowing what was attached to it. What does that mean for the ranch? She said. Silas looked at her steadily. The ranch is managed, he said. By you, primarily. And it'll keep being managed by you. I'm not, he stopped. Started again with the particular care of someone who had practiced not saying things and was now trying to say them. I'm not asking you to choose between this place and something larger. I'm asking what you want. She looked at the kitchen. Her kitchen now, in a way that it hadn't been in October. The organized larder, the properly maintained stove, the system that kept 18 men fed, and the household functioning in a way it hadn't before she'd arrived. She looked at the management book on the shelf, the notes she'd been keeping since her first week, the chronology that was now apparently a federal document. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with the straight, unguarded attention of a man who had spent the last 4 months slowly learning to let someone see him and was still in the process of that learning and knew it. I want to go to Cheyenne, she said. He nodded. One nod. Decisive. Then we go to Cheyenne, he said. They spent 4 days in March in Cheyenne. Cross had organized a working meeting with 3 other federal investigators and a representative from the territorial courts. And Clara sat at a table with these men and went through her methodology the way she'd gone through it with Cross at Ironwood, starting with what you look for in contract language, moving to how you build a cross-property pattern from financial records, explaining the specific markers that identified Front Dominion's contracts as products of a single sophisticated scheme rather than separate local operations. She was nervous going in. She told Silas this in the hotel the morning before, which was one of the harder things she'd done, because she wasn't practiced at admitting nervousness. He said, "What are you nervous about specifically?" "Being taken seriously," she said. "Walking into a room of federal investigators as what I am and being taken seriously." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been taken seriously by everyone who mattered since the 3rd day you were at Ironwood," he said. "The people in that room are professionals. They care about whether the work is good. The work is good." She looked at him. "And if anyone in that room gives you reason not to feel that way," he said, "I'll be sitting right next to you." She thought about that for a moment. "That's probably the most useful thing you've ever said to me," she said. He almost smiled, getting better at it. She walked into the meeting. She sat down. She began. By the end of the first morning, the representative from the territorial courts had asked her to clarify her methodology on the improvement clause pattern, twice not challenging it, genuinely wanting to understand it more precisely, because he was thinking about how to use it in another case. By the afternoon, one of the investigators had laid 3 contracts from a different region in front of her and asked what she saw. She saw it in about 12 minutes. The same pattern, slightly evolved. She explained what she was looking at and why. The investigator looked at his colleague. "That's what we thought," he said. "But we couldn't articulate it. The clause evolves between cases," she said. "Each iteration addresses a challenge that came up in the previous one. If you treat each contract in isolation, you miss the continuity. The pattern only appears when you look across the cases." which requires someone who has the time to look across the cases, Cross said from the end of the table, and the training to know what consistent structural deception looks like in legal language, she said, which is what you have, Cross said. She thought about her father. About 11 years in a land office, contracts spread across a clerk's desk, her father's voice over her shoulder. See this? This is the sentence that does the work. Everything else is meant to make sure you don't notice this sentence. My father gave me the training, she said. The cases gave me the practice. At the end of the 4 days, Cross sat down with her and Silas in a private meeting and outlined what the federal office was proposing, an informal consulting arrangement, case by case, under which Clara would review suspicious territorial agreements flagged by Cross's office and provide written analysis. She would be compensated. She would retain the right to decline any case. She would operate from wherever she chose. From Ironwood, Silas said, before she could answer. Cross looked at him. She'd be working from Ironwood Ranch, Silas said, with the particular certainty of a man who had already decided this and was stating it as established fact. Whatever she needs, correspondence, materials, time, that's all arranged at the ranch. You send the documents to her. Clara looked at Silas. He looked at her. Unless you want differently. She thought about a sunlit room. The idea of a desk, shelves, federal correspondence alongside recipe books and management notes. Place where the work she was good at had a name and a function and a formal connection to something that mattered. From Ironwood, she said. Cross made a note. The drive back from Cheyenne took 2 days. On the first evening, they stopped at a way station and ate a meal that Clara assessed privately as adequate and nothing more, and Silas ate it without comment, which she suspected was diplomatic. They sat outside in the cold evening, not because the interior of the way station was loud, and they'd both had enough people for the moment. Are you satisfied with how it went? Silas said. Yes, she said. More than I expected. You were good in that room. You were also in that room, she said. I sat there, he said. You worked. You backed me up. When the court representative started getting precise about jurisdiction, she said. You knew the territorial structure better than I did, and you stepped in exactly when it mattered. She looked at him. That's not just sitting there. He was quiet. We're better at this together than either of us is separately, she said. It was a direct statement of something she'd been aware of for weeks, and she wasn't sure until she said it whether she was ready to say it, but she was. He looked at the dark land around them. Wyoming in March was not soft. Cold was still serious, the ground still mostly frozen, the sky doing what the sky did out here, enormous and indifferent, and somehow beautiful in the same breath. I built Ironwood to not need anyone, he said. That was the design. Sufficient unto itself. No obligations, no dependencies. I know, she said. That was also, he stopped, pressed his jaw. That was also a way of not risking anything. She looked at him. Things that don't need anyone don't lose anyone, he said. The words came out like something he'd thought about enough that they'd worn, smooth. That's not a good way to live. I knew it before you got here. I just didn't know what to do about it. She thought about the honest advertisement. About a man who said, hard winters, practical arrangement, no promises beyond what was practical. An advertisement that was, she understood now, the most honest cry for company she'd ever seen, from a man who didn't know that was what it was. You're not good at needing people, she said. You're getting better at it, she said. He looked at her with the November River eyes that she'd learned to read now, not all the way, not perfectly, but enough. You're not exactly easy to practice on, he said. I know, she said. I'm not sure I'd respect you as much if it were easy. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's an unsettling thing to say. It's true, she said. The night was cold and still around them. Somewhere out on the flat land, something moved, animal or wind, hard to tell in the dark. I didn't know what I was getting when I advertised, Silas said. I thought I was looking for a housekeeper who could legally stay. I know, she said. I got something entirely different. She considered that. Is that a complaint? No, he said, with the certainty of a man who has checked the question and found the answer. She looked at her hands, at the practical, unlovely hands of someone who had spent 30 years cooking and cleaning and managing and reading and paying attention, and who had found, in a place she'd come to purely out of necessity, that all of it added up to something she hadn't known to hope for. I didn't know what I was getting either, she said. I thought I was looking for work I could survive in. And instead, he said, she looked at Ironwood's direction, though she couldn't see it from here. 1,200 acres and 18 men and a kitchen that was hers and a desk that would be hers, and a set of skills that had finally found a landscape large enough to use them fully. Instead, I got a place where I didn't have to make myself smaller, she said. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over, without ceremony or performance, and put his hand over hers. She let him. They sat like that in the Wyoming dark, two imperfect people who had arrived at each other sideways and found something neither of them had known to plan for. Back at Ironwood, the life continued imperfectly, the way real things do. Rourke and Clara still occasionally disagreed about ranch decisions, about priorities, about the right way to handle a situation when their instincts ran in different directions. He was getting less automatically defensive about being wrong. He was getting better at letting him come to a conclusion himself rather than presenting it to him fully formed. They were, in the unglamorous way of people who respect each other without particularly seeking to, becoming something like allies. Tommy wrote to his mother in Iowa. She wrote back. He read Clara the letter, unnecessarily, but she listened the whole way through. Merrick's Sloan stayed at Ironwood through March, working, doing what he'd told Silas. He would do honest work for the days he was there. In April, when Cross's office formally notified him that his cooperation credit had been approved and the prosecution of his peripheral role in the livestock theft was being declined. In favor of the larger case, he came to find Clara in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. That same doorway. I'm heading to Colorado, he said. There's work there. Stock management for a breeding operation. Good, she said. He stopped. Tried again. I wanted to say that you didn't have to make the case for keeping me here, after what I'd been part of. She looked at him steadily. I made the case for what the situation needed, she said. You happen to be in the right position to be useful. He almost smiled. That's a hard way to say you did me a kindness. I didn't do you a kindness, she said. I made a practical decision. You did yourself the kindness by showing up in a blizzard with an envelope when you didn't have to. He was quiet for a moment. Your father taught you to read contracts, he said. Who taught you to read people? She thought about it honestly. 12 years of feeding them, she said. He left before supper. She watched from the kitchen window as he rode out, and then she went back to the stove, where something needed attention, as something always did. The first case Cross sent her arrived in April. A single envelope, thick with documents, a cover letter from Cross explaining the situation, 3 ranches in another territory, similar pattern to Frontier Dominion, but different company, different representatives, same underlying architecture. 2 families had already signed. One was in negotiation and had requested federal assistance. Clara cleared the kitchen table after supper. She laid the documents out. She read the first contract the way her father had taught her, and she'd practiced for 20 years, not looking for the obvious problems, looking for the sentence that was doing work it shouldn't be doing, clause that looked like furniture but was actually load-bearing, the language that revealed, in the gap between what it said and what it didn't say, what someone had been very carefully trying to hide. She found it on page 2. Different clause, different structure, same intent. The same fingerprint of someone who had built a machine for taking things from people who couldn't afford to lose them, and had made the machine just complicated enough that most people would never see it for what it was. She made a note in the margin. Then she started from the beginning, because the first read was never the last read, and the thing that mattered was not finding one problem, but understanding the whole shape of what you were looking at. Silas came to the kitchen an hour later. He looked at the document spread across the table and asked no questions, just poured himself a coffee and sat down at the other end of the table with his own ranch paperwork and settled into the comfortable quiet of 2 people working in the same room. The lamp burned between them. Outside, Ironwood Ranch went about its nighttime in the way it always did now, the sounds she knew, the rhythms she'd learned, the particular darkness of Wyoming that had felt foreign in October and felt, by April, like something she had a right to. She worked. She found what was hidden in the documents. She always did. Not because she was extraordinary. She was careful to never tell herself that. She was simply someone who paid attention, who took seriously what others dismissed as fine print, who believed that the people on the other side of a predatory contract deserved someone reading it as hard as the person who'd written it. That was the whole of it. Pay attention. Follow the numbers. Treat the gap between what is written and what is true as the most important space in any document, because that is where the lie lives, and where the lie lives is where the harm begins. And understand, this was the part her father had spent years trying to give her, and she'd spent years learning to trust that the most important work is often invisible until something goes wrong, that the people who prevent disasters rarely get credit for the disasters they prevented, and that being useful in a quiet and thorough way is not a lesser thing than being useful loudly. It is, in fact, the harder thing, and the thing most worth doing. She turned to page 3. The night settled around Ironwood Ranch, solid and ordinary and hers.